Chapter 28. Looking at Wu Yueling, who threw down the blanket and ran away in surprise, Lin Xiao didn't know what to say. This little one was really quite smart, and he was even considerate. She silently walked to the shore and bent down with some difficulty to pick up the blanket. Holding it in her hand, she stretched out her claws and used her sharp nails to scratch the blanket a few times. Then, she cut a small blanket into 2 long strips of cloth. One piece was wrapped around her upper body, covering her scarred chest and blackened abdomen. The other piece was tied directly under her waist into a skirt. With the blanket wrapped into clothes, Lin Xiao heaved a sigh of relief. She smiled at Wu Yueling from afar. Then, when Wu Yueling saw her terrifying smile, she immediately turned around and ran a few steps back. Lin Xiao, all right, although she did look a little like that now, could you not have such a big reaction, child? You looked like you were afraid that she would die just now. Lin Xiao turned around and walked to the lake, slowly squatting down. Fortunately, although her body was stiff, her joints could still bend. However, she couldn't move too fast, or else she wouldn't be able to move at all. She looked at the reflection of the figure on the flat surface. Her hair was messy, and her facial features couldn't be seen clearly under the hair. She used her hand to push her hair to the back of her head, revealing her entire face. The wound on her face had healed at some point, leaving behind a large dark brown scar on her cheeks. A pair of strange, pitch-black eyes emitted light. This appearance was indeed terrifying. She smiled, and the scar on her face twisted. It was very scary. No wonder the little one ran away when he saw her smile. Lin Xiao imagined how Wu Yueling would feel when she saw her smiling face just now. Her current appearance was terrifying even if she covered it with her hair, and it would be even more terrifying if she exposed her face. It was better to cover it. She slowly stood up and walked in the direction of the grass. Then, she found a cleaner place and sat down. She had a lot of things to think about now. Looking at Wu Yueling standing not far away, she didn't know if it was because of her space. This child's condition was slowly improving here. She didn't seem to be starving to death even if she didn't eat. This was very abnormal. Could it be that time had stopped here? That's not right either. Look at the way the grass grows. There was a flow of time here. Is that water? Could it be that Xiao Budian drank the water from the lake to ease the hunger in her body? But it was impossible for him to recover his bodily functions, right? She felt that her space was very mysterious, and she didn't know what special effects the lake had. Moreover, she had drunk quite a lot of the lake water. Lin Xiao suddenly remembered that when he first entered this space, he also fell asleep in the lake. Although she didn't know how long she had slept, her body had become flexible after she woke up. At that time, she didn't notice that it was a problem with the lake water. She thought it was a change in her body. Now that he thought about it, it should be the effect of the lake water. This lake water seems to be able to promote my zombie level. Thinking of this, Lin Xiao was delighted. It seemed that this space was indeed the golden finger she had obtained after her rebirth. There was also the mutated strawberry from before. After washing it with the lake water, it no longer smelled bad. So the lake water can also remove odors? After thinking it through, Lin Xiao's mood was not so depressed. But she looked at Wu Yueling and thought angrily in her heart. Originally, she wanted to send it back to that man. But now, she didn't want to. She changed her mind. Who said that Wu Chengyue was a good man? Who said that he was a gentle and kind person? He was clearly a smiling tiger, okay? He struck her with lightning without saying a word. She would remember this. Even if Lu Tianyu did that to him, Lu Tianyu was already dead. It had nothing to do with Lin Xiao. But how was she going to get out now? She didn't know what the situation was like outside. Was there someone guarding the place? It would be great if she could sense the thoughts of the people outside in this space. That way, she could know if there was anyone outside. Lin Xiao tried to close her eyes and listen attentively. Just as she closed her eyes and tried to sense, a hazy image suddenly appeared in her mind. The image was very familiar. It was the place where she entered the space. How could this be? As soon as Lin Xiao opened her eyes, the image immediately disappeared from her mind. Her eyes flashed with strong doubt and confusion, and then she closed her eyes again. Sure enough, as soon as she closed her eyes and thought about the situation outside, The image appeared in her mind again. It was even much clearer than before, but she couldn't see the color because it was all black, white, and gray. And the range was also expanding. She also saw some figures. These people were wearing camouflage, and their faces were clean. They were all carrying guns and walking around casually. These were humans, not zombies. Other than seeing the image, Lin Xiao couldn't sense any aura. But she knew that this must be the situation outside. But this was enough, because she saw an army station not far away, although it was only temporary. But without thinking, she knew that this was the army led by Wu Chengyue. And the zombies in this area were basically cleared. There was no sign of a zombie at all. Lin Xiao lowered her eyelids and rolled her eyes, and the scene outside also changed. Looking from left to right, she found that it seemed to be evening outside. There were soldiers in military uniforms coming and going, and there were even people sitting together in twos and threes. As expected, there were people guarding here. How could she sneak out now? With so many people, she was afraid that once she appeared, she would be surrounded. Lin Xiao thought bitterly in her heart while observing the situation outside. Unfortunately, she couldn't sense what the people outside were thinking. Otherwise, she might know more about the situation and be able to adapt. Opening her eyes, the scene outside in Lin Xiao's mind disappeared. It was as if her eyes were a switch. Once she closed them, she could see the situation outside. But once she opened them, she would be cut off from the outside. As soon as she turned around, she suddenly saw Wu Yueling, who she didn't know when she sneaked up to her. She stood less than half a meter away from her, silently looking at her. Suddenly seeing Lin Xiao open her eyes, Wu Yueling's eyes froze for a moment. Her feet moved, and she subconsciously wanted to run again. But she only took half a step before she pulled back, and continued to stand there looking at Lin Xiao. She was still a little afraid of Lin Xiao, but she couldn't help but want to stay by her side. Lin Xiao looked at her, and didn't want to move anymore. She just sat there and rested. She didn't know why, but after looking at the situation outside twice, she felt a wave of fatigue. He felt a wave of fatigue, and his whole body felt sluggish. Not physically, but mentally. Chapter 29. As she sat there, she fell asleep again. Then she had a dream. In the dream, she went out of the space. But the people around her didn't notice her, as if she was invisible. Then she broke into a run, and no one noticed her. And her movements weren't stiff at all, and her legs looked very flexible. She kept running in the direction of the strawberry field, and didn't know how long she ran before she saw the strawberry field. Then Lin Xiao woke up and opened her eyes to look. She found that she was still in the space. She thought that she wanted to leave so badly that she had this dream, but she felt that she was very strange. Would normal zombies have dreams? Lin Xiao opened her eyes and found that she was still sitting cross-legged on the ground, as if she was meditating. She could also fall asleep like this. It was really strange. She felt a little thirsty and looked at Wu Yueling, who was sitting beside her. She found that she didn't know where she found some hay and made a thick layer on the ground. Then she sat on it and played with the grass dragonflies she made. Lin Xiao stretched her legs and felt that they were still a little stiff. But she didn't know why, but there was a faint sour feeling. She used a lot of strength to stand up from the ground with great difficulty. She slowly walked towards the lake, but then she remembered that this was the place where she took a bath. So she walked around the lake, all the way to the other side of the lake. Looking back at Wu Yueling, who was walking behind her, Lin Xiao felt that this child was a little dependent on her. She walked very slowly, and her legs were a little heavy, and there was a kind of sour feeling. It was a little difficult to walk. Lin Xiao's attention was focused on walking and the lake, as well as the question of why zombies could dream. He didn't notice why his legs were sore. Logically speaking, she was a zombie, so she shouldn't have any feelings. If she found this out, maybe she would find that her body had some incredible changes. But she didn't find it. She spent half an hour to go around to the other side of the lake. She stopped by the lake, and then slowly squatted down on the edge of the lake. She used her hands to directly drink the water, and drank a few mouthfuls. She felt a little better. After drinking the water, Lin Xiao took a few steps back. Standing by the lake, he closed his eyes to see if there was anyone outside. However, the scene that appeared in his mind this time was not the place where he had entered the space. Lin Xiao hurriedly opened his eyes. A trace of uncertainty flashed through his eyes before he immediately closed them again. Sure enough, the scene this time was still not the location of the city where he entered the space. This time, she saw a field of strawberries. A mutated strawberry field. Lin Xiao opened his eyes again and was in a daze. He couldn't understand how he could see the scene of the strawberry field. Could it be that her previous thoughts were wrong? What he saw was not fixed at the place where she entered the space. Was it because he could see wherever he wanted? At this thought, Lin Xiao closed his eyes and tried to see where the soldiers were. However, he couldn't see anything. His mind was still filled with a field of strawberries. Moreover, it was the same place she had been to before. How could this be? Could it be that she had already left her original position? Or was it just a figment of his imagination? Would he appear in the place where Wu Chengyue and his men were guarding when he went out? Lin Xiao thought it was possible, but the scene in his mind was very clear. The moon hung high in the sky, indicating that it was the middle of the night. Had she really arrived at the field of strawberries? This thought had been tightly grasping Lin Xiao's mind. She wanted to go out, but she didn't dare to. On one hand, she was afraid that his thoughts were wrong, but on the other hand, she wanted to confirm whether his thoughts were correct. Plop! At this moment, the sound of a stone falling into the water suddenly sounded. Lin Xiao opened his eyes and found Wu Yueling squatting on the ground by the lake. She picked up a small stone on the ground and threw it into the water out of boredom. However, his expression seemed to be wondering if there was anything else in the lake. Lin Xiao gritted his teeth and decided to go out for a while. He had to confirm the situation. Otherwise, he would make her feel very uncomfortable. If he went out and was still in the original position of the soldiers, she could immediately change her mind and come back. It would probably take less than a second. She didn't believe that those people would be able to react and attack her in such a short time. With a decision in his heart, Lin Xiao took a deep breath. Then he thought to himself, go out. In a flash, a real strawberry field appeared in front of her. It wasn't just a figment of her imagination. Lin Xiao's eyes widened, and a gleam of surprise flashed across her dark eyes. She turned in a circle and found that she was really in the field of strawberries, not in the city. She still remembered that dream. In the dream, she ran for a long time to reach the field of strawberries. But in reality, it was only about 10 kilometers from Wu Chengyue's place to this field of strawberries. She didn't have to run for long at all. But in her dream, she ran for a long time. Why was it like this? What happened? Lin Xiao couldn't figure it out. She felt that her head was a little big. If she could move space just by dreaming, then she would have to escape from space in the future. Does it mean that I only need to have a dream? But what if she wasn't dreaming? Or if she couldn't have such a dream? This dream wasn't something that she could control. Thinking of this, Lin Xiao felt like crying. She had such a good skill, but she didn't know where the switch was. This feeling is so painful, isn't it? She took a look at her surroundings and confirmed that she wasn't dreaming this time. Lin Xiao bent down and picked 2 hands full of strawberries. Actually, there weren't many, just 6 or 7. Then she entered the space. As soon as she entered, she saw Wu Yueling looking around in a daze and at a loss. She didn't know what she was looking for. When she came in, Wu Yueling's eyes were immediately glued to her. Then her eyes turned red, and she stared at her with a face full of grievance and dissatisfaction. Lin Xiao, what was this child trying to do? Because she couldn't sense the little one's thoughts, she could only stretch out her hands. She stretched out the strawberries in her hands towards her. Wu Yueling was stunned when she saw the strawberries. Then, she immediately covered her nose and turned her face away. She ran a few steps to the side with a look of disgust. So smelly. This time, Lin Xiao could sense her thoughts. Lin Xiao thought for a moment. How could she coax this child to eat strawberries? No matter what, she had to wash it first and see if the lake water could get rid of this unpleasant smell. She turned around and walked to the side of the lake. Her movements weren't very agile. She put the big strawberries on the shore and carefully scrubbed them one by one in the water. Chapter 30. Seeing her movements, Wu Yueling covered her nose and moved closer to her, but still kept a distance of 1 or 2 meters. After washing the strawberries, Lin Xiao found that there was nothing to put on the strawberries. So she was stunned again. Suddenly, she thought that the leaves of the strawberries seemed to be very large. She might as well go out and pick a few leaves to put the strawberries in. Thinking of this, she gently put a few washed strawberries on the ground. Then she disappeared again. Out of the space, she picked a few large pieces of leaves and came in. Then she washed them with the lake water and brushed them. Then she washed the strawberries again and wrapped them with the leaves. This time, the stench was gone. Holding the strawberries with both hands, Lin Xiao walked a few steps to the edge of the grass. Then she put the strawberries on the ground with the leaves, stood up, looked at Wu Yueling, and waved to her. Seeing her waving, Wu Yueling's eyes were full of confusion. She pinched her nose tightly and didn't come over. She just stood there and watched. Seeing that she didn't come over, Lin Xiao's ears suddenly twitched. She heard a little movement. She turned her head and saw the shadow of a small gray fur ball coming out of the grass. It stood by the grass and looked at Lin Xiao and the strawberries at her feet. Lin Xiao looked at it and was surprised to find that the rabbit's eyes were shining at the strawberries at her feet. It seemed to want to come over but didn't dare. The rabbit's expression was exactly the same as Wu Yueling's. Lin Xiao thought, are these two the same kind? Looking at the desire in the rabbit's eyes, Lin Xiao tried to throw one of the smallest strawberries to it. The rabbit was startled by the strawberry that was suddenly thrown at it. It turned around and jumped directly into the grass. Lin Xiao stood still. Sure enough, after a few seconds, the rabbit stuck its head out of the grass and looked around. It found that there was no danger. She jumped out and moved to the side of Strawberry. It held the strawberry with its two short front paws and immediately turned around and slipped into the grass again. She forced it to eat before, but it refused. Now, it came to snatch it from her. After watching the rabbit take the strawberry away in confusion, Lin Xiao turned around and waved to Wu Yueling. Come here. Lin Xiao looked at Wu Yueling's sparkling eyes and said to her in his heart. She didn't know if her thoughts could be conveyed, but her gaze did. Then, she saw Wu Yueling shake her head at her. Lin Xiao was stunned for a moment. Then he thought hesitantly, did he hear my thoughts? She picked up a strawberry and sniffed it. Then he waved his hand at Wu Yueling and said to her in his heart, come here, the strawberries are washed. It doesn't stink. After saying this in his heart, Lin Xiao stared at Wu Yueling, waiting for her reaction. She wasn't sure if the little guy shook his head because he heard her thoughts. He was smart enough to guess it from his eyes and movements. But no matter which one it was, it meant that he could communicate with her. If Wu Yueling didn't speak, she would never speak. Even to Wu Chengyue, he would not speak. He had always been using his actions to express his thoughts, so she might be able to guess what he meant from his actions. Lin Xiao indicated that the strawberries had been washed and didn't stink. Wu Yueling moved. She slowly loosened the hand that was pinching her nose. Then she raised her nose and sniffed in the direction of the strawberries to make sure that she didn't smell the stench just now. Then she put her hand down. But she didn't walk towards Lin Xiao. It really doesn't stink? Will she lie to me? But this strawberry is poisonous, right? Will I die if I eat it? But the rabbit just now also ate it last time. It didn't die. Wu Yueling thought to herself. She looked at Lin Xiao while feeling conflicted. Lin Xiao sensed her thoughts and didn't stand still. She turned slightly and sat on the ground next to the strawberries. Then she picked up the strawberries and sniffed the sweet smell. No wonder the rabbit ran over so quickly. It turned out that its nose was also very sensitive. However, this sweet smell did not have any allure to Lin Xiao. It didn't arouse her appetite. But the smell of Wu Yueling made her salivate. Lin Xiao glanced at Wu Yueling vaguely. Then she waved at her. Seeing her look over, Lin Xiao pointed at the strawberry in her hand. Then she put the strawberry in her mouth and took a bite. The smooth and tasteless texture was still not tasty. The inside of the strawberry was pink, which was different from its skin. Lin Xiao finished the strawberry in 2 or 3 bites. Then she spread her hands at Wu Yueling. Wu Yueling was starting to believe Lin Xiao's words. She slowly walked over. As she walked, she sniffed hard to see if the stench was still there. But when she walked all the way to Lin Xiao's side, she didn't smell the stench just now. Lin Xiao picked up a beautiful and plump strawberry and handed it to her. There were still water droplets on the strawberry. She said to her with her eyes, "Eat it." It's not poisonous. But she was afraid that Wu Yueling didn't understand what she meant. She pointed at the strawberry and shook her hand. Then she drew her hand across her neck. She closed her eyes, tilted her head, and stuck out her tongue. She made a dead face for Wu Yueling to see. Wu Yueling had already understood what she meant. But when she saw Lin Xiao make such a ghost face, she suddenly felt strange. She didn't know how to react. Lin Xiao opened her eyes and looked at Wu Yueling, who was in a daze. She didn't sense her thoughts, but Wu Yueling looked at her as if she was looking at a lunatic. Lin Xiao was silent. Was she being looked down upon by this child? Was it? Was it? Wu Yueling looked at Lin Xiao as if she was a lunatic. Then she silently reached out and took the strawberry that Lin Xiao was still holding in the air. She carefully put it in front of her nose and smelled it. There was no stench. Instead, there was a very nice sweet smell. She pinched it with her hand. It felt a little soft. Lin Xiao stretched out a finger and pointed at her mouth. She meant for her to take a bite to test the taste. Wu Yueling looked at her hesitantly and guessed for a while. She didn't dare to eat it for fear that it would be poisonous. But now, the smell of the strawberries seemed to be very delicious. It was so fragrant and sweet. Would it be very sweet when she tasted it? Lin Xiao looked at her confused face. She didn't even need to sense what she was thinking. She pointed in the direction where the rabbit ran and said, "It's okay. The rabbit isn't dead." Then Wu Yueling seemed to finally be unable to resist the temptation of the strawberry fragrance. She opened her mouth and took a small bite. She chose to believe in Lin Xiao. A sweet taste with a hint of sourness spread on the tip of her tongue. Wu Yueling's eyes immediately lit up. She took a big bite and ate it with a look of enjoyment on her face. She didn't care that it was poisonous and couldn't be eaten. She ate noisily. Her stomach was empty. She had been hungry for a long time. Chapter 31. Seeing that the little girl finally ate something, Lin Xiao was slightly relieved. But she couldn't just eat strawberries. She had to find other food for her. Since she didn't plan to return it for the time being, she had to find food for her first. She also had to find a few sets of clothes for herself. And she had to find a way to change the current condition of her body. It wasn't a good idea to be so stiff all the time. And her level seemed to be a bit low, and her strength was too weak. She had to improve her strength. Otherwise, if she encountered a level 5 zombie leader or a psychic above level 5, she would be completely abused. Or there was still time to hide in the space. She just didn't know how to improve her strength. Was she going to kill zombies and take their cores like other zombies? But she didn't seem to have any reaction to the level 3 intelligent zombies core. Or should she kill people to take their cores? But she couldn't just kill people. If the target was a bad person, in this post-apocalyptic world, there were really a lot of bad people. Wasn't Lu Tianyu one? And the ones who harmed her to death? If Lin Xiao returned to her original strength, she wouldn't have to worry about Lin Yong and the others. She could directly fight with them, and there might be a chance of winning. In short, if she wanted to go to the south to find her family, she had to improve her strength first. Otherwise, she didn't know what she would encounter on the way. In this world, zombies weren't the only scary things. Thinking about it, Lin Xiao wanted to turn around and leave the space, but she suddenly thought of the helpless and wronged expression on Xiao Budian's face when she came in. She felt that she might be bored or annoyed by being alone. Why not catch that rabbit for her to play with? But although the rabbit was small, it seemed to be very fierce. It would bite, right? She moved her ears and carefully listened to the movements in the grass around her. She sniffed again. Then she confirmed the location of the rabbit. Lin Xiao stood up, turned around, and walked slowly into the grass. Wu Yueling looked at her curiously, not knowing what she was going to do. After a while, she saw Lin Xiao come out with the rabbit. Lin Xiao grabbed the soft hair behind the rabbit's neck, and the rabbit shrunk its hind legs. Its two front paws were still holding the half-eaten strawberry, and its ears were drooping. Its two red eyes were wide open. She walked in front of Wu Yueling and extended the rabbit in front of her. Wu Yueling looked up at her, then at the rabbit. His expression was a little dazed and confused. Was this for her? She didn't want it. This rabbit was so ugly. No. Wu Yueling took a few glances at the rabbit and suddenly twisted her face, looking disgusted. Lin Xiao, who sensed her thoughts, was speechless. Didn't they say that little girls like furry animals? Who said that? Come out. Although the rabbit was a little gray, it wasn't ugly. His eyes were round and his ears were long. Her teeth weren't so big that they were about to protrude. She was clearly quite cute. Lin Xiao looked at the rabbit in front of her and confirmed that it was still very cute. Then, he stretched his hand out in front of Wu Yueling. Wu Yueling still turned her face away, not even looking at him. She continued to nibble on her strawberries. Lin Xiao put the rabbit down and poked Wu Yueling's head. The child hadn't washed his hair for many days. The ponytail on his head was loose and had a layer of grease on it. After being poked by her, Wu Yueling looked up at her. Lin Xiao pointed at the sky and then at herself. Then she disappeared. She did this to tell her that she would do the same before leaving next time. Wu Yueling saw Lin Xiao suddenly disappear and was stunned for a moment. Then her eyes turned red and her mouth pouted. She looked around in a panic but didn't see Lin Xiao. Maybe she was used to the previous experiences, but she still didn't see Lin Xiao after a few glances. After making sure that she had really left, Wu Yueling calmed down again. She continued to nibble on her strawberry silently and finally finished the whole strawberry. After finishing, she looked down at the remaining strawberry on the ground. She sat down and picked up another one to continue eating. After Lin Xiao left the space, she looked at the strawberry field. The moonlight shone on the ground like a faint layer of silver. Strawberries couldn't be kept in the space for long after they were picked. She wondered if the seedlings could be planted in the space. Thinking of this, Lin Xiao immediately bent down in the strawberry field and began to dig at the roots of a strawberry with her claws. She didn't know how to plant, so she could only dig out the whole strawberry with the soil. Then she threw it directly into the space. Fortunately, her claws were very useful, so it was easy for her to dig. But because her body was not very flexible, her movements were very slow. After an hour, the entire strawberry field had been hollowed out by Lin Xiao. After digging up dozens of strawberries, Lin Xiao finally stopped. Then her figure flashed and she entered the space. As soon as she entered, she found that the strawberry plants were thrown in the middle of the grass, and the grass there was crushed. Wu Yueling was holding the last 2 strawberries at this time and was far away, because the strawberries that Lin Xiao threw in were still full of strawberries. These strawberries hadn't been picked or washed, so there was no need to talk about the stench. It immediately made the air in this place stinky. Lin Xiao didn't mind the stench. She slowly separated these strawberries one by one. Then she began to dig holes in the grass in the space and directly planted these strawberries. This series of actions also took her a long time to complete. After she finally finished planting the strawberries, she stood up and looked at Wu Yueling's figure. She found that she had already run to the other side of the lake and was curled up in a ball sleeping on the grass. Lin Xiao suddenly patted her forehead. She should have gotten something to sleep on first, but in the end, she forgot about it. Looking at the little one sleeping on the grass like this, she looked so pitiful. Lin Xiao went to the lake to wash her hands and washed all the mud off her hands. Then she looked at the strawberries behind her, and they were all listless. They had to be watered in a while. Her figure flashed and she exited the space, her gaze sweeping the surroundings. She saw that there seemed to be a house not far away. It should be the place where the owner of this strawberry field lived before the end of the world. She lifted her feet and walked towards the house. After a while, she reached the front of the house. This was a house with a flat roof, and the doors and windows were already broken. The things in the house had been turned upside down, and it was obvious that it had been ransacked. But that was a long time ago, because now these things were covered with a thick layer of dust. Lin Xiao walked in and looked inside. There weren't many things here, and basically everything that could be used had been taken away. She wandered around in the bedroom and living room, but she couldn't even find a broken quilt. She found a dusty mat, and it was a bamboo mat. But because it was a bamboo mat, it didn't spoil after being left for so long. Chapter 32. She took the mat out of the house and hung it on the railing outside. Then, Lin Xiao looked around and broke off a branch with a leaf on it. She patted the mat hard with the leaves, and the dust on it immediately flew all over the sky. Lin Xiao subconsciously covered her nose, and the hand holding the branch stretched far away. She patted and swept. After a while, she saw that there was no more dust flying. She stopped and turned back into the house. There was only one house nearby. Apart from the mat, she also found some old clothes, some of which were already rotten. But fortunately, there were still two that could be worn. Although they were all male, Lin Xiao, who was already naked, didn't care about the difference between men and women. She shook the dust again. Finally, Lin Xiao found some pots, bowls, ladles, and so on. Anyway, as long as it was useful, she threw it into the space. Beds, tables, stools, chairs, and sofas were all thrown in. But not much. After seeing that she had moved all the things in this house, Lin Xiao turned back into the space. Originally, there was only grass in the space, and she didn't care about it when she was alone. Anyway, she just needed to lie down on the ground and she could fall asleep. Although zombies didn't seem to need to sleep, but now there was a child living in her space, and she couldn't let the child sleep on the ground. He had a blanket as a cushion before, but now the blanket had been torn apart by her. Fortunately, this strawberry field used to be inhabited, and the owner's things were not all broken. After Lin Xiao moved all the things in, she piled them up in another place far away from the strawberry field. After she came in, she began to be busy again. She swept the dust, wiped the dust, and washed the things. Anyway, she just took a rag and wet it with the lake water. Then she wiped the beds, tables, and chairs, and washed the pots, bowls, ladles, and so on. After washing, she dragged the wooden bed to a flat place, and then used her hands to pick a lot of grass and spread it on the bed. Then she spread the bamboo mat on the grass. After doing all this, she went around to the other side of the lake. She gently picked up Wu Yueling, who was still asleep, and then walked back. Then she put her on the bed. Wu Yueling lay on the bed and didn't wake up. She just unconsciously curled up into a ball. Lin Xiao picked up an adult shirt, shook it clean, and put it on her. She then turned around and took the other clothes to the lake to wash them. After washing them, she spread them out on the grass to cool them. After being busy for a while, Lin Xiao finally finished cleaning up. Then she took a bucket and went to water the strawberries. Lin Xiao, who had been busy, didn't realize that her movements had become much more agile. His body was no longer as stiff as before. After watering, Lin Jizai sat on the only rotten sofa to rest. Although she really didn't feel tired, it seemed that the more she did, the more energetic she became. She just suddenly finished her work and had nothing to do, so she just sat there. Sitting cross-legged on the sofa, she closed her eyes and sensed the situation outside. When he found nothing out of the ordinary, he got off the sofa and left the space. It was already bright outside. She had been busy all night cleaning up the furniture and whatnot. She doesn't know if the strawberries she dug into the space will come back to life. In fact, Lin Xiao wasn't sure about this. After getting out of the space, Lin Xiao began to bypass the area where Wu Chengyue was. She planned to go into the city first and see if there was a bookstore or a big supermarket. Maybe she could find a map there. She still casually put on a loose shirt, although it was unwashed. But for Lin Xiao, who was a zombie, wearing it didn't have any psychological barriers. After getting out of the space, Lin Xiao noticed that her body seemed to be a lot more relaxed. She also found that her movements could be flexible and she could do whatever she wanted. It seemed that the effect of the lightning strike had passed. Lin Xiao shook hands. She didn't know why, but she faintly had a strange feeling. It seemed that after being struck by lightning this time, her strength seemed to have increased a lot. She thought and immediately stopped. Looking at a tree on the side of the road, she hesitantly walked over. Standing under the tree, Lin Xiao showed her claws. The dark claws were sharp, shining with a metallic luster. She glanced at the branch on the tree that was more than 3 meters tall and as thick as an arm. She suddenly jumped over and fiercely slashed at the branch. Pa! Huala hua sha! The sound of wood falling to the ground was followed by the sound of rustling leaves. Lin Xiao looked at the branch that she had cut off. The part that was cut off was smooth and neat. It didn't look like she had cut it off with her nails at all. It looked like she had used a very fast and sharp knife to cut it off at once. But she looked at her own claws. The length was only about 10 centimeters, not very long, and the cut on this branch was about 4 centimeters in diameter. How could her claws cut such a smooth cut? Because her nails weren't long enough. and when she used her claws to cut it just now, she didn't seem to feel that her nails had touched anything. But the tree branch was indeed cut off. Lin Xiao stared at her claws for a long time, but she still couldn't figure it out. She stood up and stepped on the tree branch. She stretched out her claws and slashed at the branch behind the tree branch. This time, she felt something. It was as if a few rays of light flashed in her claws. Before her claws could touch these tree branches, they seemed to have been cut by an air blade and then broken in advance. So useful. Lin Xiao looked at her claws, and her eyes suddenly lit up. She looked at the main branch of the tree, which was about as thick as a thin woman's waist. She thought for a moment and raised her hand. She swung her claws hard and swung them at the tree branch. Cha! A crisp sound rang out. Lin Xiao looked at the 4 deep scratches on the tree branch, and her eyes lit up. She leaned over and sized up the depth of the scratches. She found that among the 4 scratches, the one on her index finger was the deepest. She had already cut off 2/3 of the tree branch. Lin Xiao raised her hand, pressed the tree branch on top of her claws, and pushed hard. She was very strong. When the tree was pushed by her, there was only a kacha sound. The entire tree slowly fell backwards. She retracted her hand and turned around in satisfaction. She walked towards the city. It seemed that the attack power of her claws had increased again. Not long after she walked out, she suddenly smelled a few different auras. A few humans and a very powerful zombie. Lin Xiao's sharp senses told her that this zombie was probably at the peak of level 4 or above, and she was a little familiar with the auras of those humans. Weren't they the superhumans who wanted to stop her during the day yesterday? Chapter 33. A burst of flames soared into the sky. The fire wasn't too conspicuous in the daytime. However, the burning flames leaped up high. There were traces of fire all around. Xiaodong and the other 4 stood in a group, desperately using their abilities to deal with the zombies in front of them. At this moment, the 5 of them looked very embarrassed, and their eyes revealed despair. A level 4, a level 3, and 3 level 2 ability users. This was originally not a simple team. If they were outside the base, even if they encountered a level 4 ability zombie, they would still have the power to fight it. However, this time, they did not encounter a level 4, but a level 5, because the 5 of them were surrounded by a large number of ordinary zombies. And these ordinary zombies were all controlled, desperately rushing towards the group of humans. They opened their mouths wide, their eyes filled with the desire for food. They stretched out their hands into claws, wanting to come forward and tear these humans apart. Xiaodong and the other 4 had their backs against each other, forming a circle and throwing out ability attacks at the zombies that rushed over. With the help of Huang Zhao's wind ability, Xiaodong turned his fire ability into a circle of fire, trapping them inside the firewall. As long as the zombies approached, they would immediately be caught by the firewall and burned. On the other side of the zombie horde, a skinny figure stood there, his eyes flashing with wild sharpness and cold-killing intent. This was the appearance of a man in his 40s or 50s, but his body had changed too much. One could only vaguely see his age before he died. It was impossible to tell what he looked like. At this moment, both of its eyes were pitch black, but there was an obvious red light flashing in the middle. It was like the pupils of a beast, firm and determined. Its back was bent, and it stood there with its legs upright. Its hanging hands were somewhat deformed. Its hands became huge, and its 5 fingers were twice as long as a normal person. Its sharp nails were 3 centimeters long. It looked incomparably hard. This zombie's face, in addition to its black eyes, had an infrared glow, and its mouth was also cracked to the ears. But at this time, it did not open its mouth, so only a rough crack could be seen. However, there were stains of fresh blood on this mouth. It calmly looked at the 5 humans in the encirclement of zombies. Its eyes did not have the strong desire of other zombies. This was a level 5 zombie leader. A zombie leader of this level could not only control hundreds of ordinary zombies, but also make them act according to their orders. It could also control a small number of intelligent zombies. Take the 2 beside it, for example. The aura of a level 5 zombie was very strong, so the intelligent zombies next to it didn't dare to go against its will. Otherwise, they would be torn to shreds and have their corpse cores eaten. At this time, Xiaodong and the others saw the calm zombie in front of them. He also recognized that it was a level 5 zombie leader. Their eyes were filled with despair, but they were unwilling to persevere. While madly attacking the ordinary zombies outside the firewall, they were also thinking of ways to escape. But they all knew that there was no way for them to escape the pursuit of this level 5 zombie. There were originally more than 10 people, but now there were only 5 of them who were relatively strong. The others had already been torn apart and eaten by a large number of zombies. At this moment, Xiaodong regretted not forcing everyone to follow the army. Instead, he left with them. Well, now his premonition was correct. It turned out that the dangerous feeling of being targeted was brought by this level 5 zombie. The 5 of them didn't speak because it was useless to say anything now. A trace of darkness flashed in Huang Zhao's eyes. He faintly glanced at Xiaodong, who was beside him. Then he gave the others a look, and the other 3's eyes immediately flashed a trace of understanding. At this time, Xiaodong also couldn't hold on anymore. He had used too much of his ability, and at this time, his energy core was showing signs of drying up. But he didn't dare to stop, because as soon as he stopped, the others wouldn't be able to hold on for more than 30 seconds, and they would be torn apart by the zombies that pounced on them. Moreover, the zombie leader didn't even make a move. Not to mention the zombie leader, even the intelligent zombies around it. They just stood there and watched quietly, waiting for their side to die of exhaustion. I can't hold on anymore. My energy is almost exhausted. We have to find a way to hold on. Although Xiaodong's tough face was still calm, his face was a little pale. Sweat seeped out of his forehead and dripped down. At this time, Huang Zhao's eyes suddenly flashed, and he secretly nodded to the other 3. Then he turned his head to Xiaodong and said, I have a way to temporarily hold on. But when Xiaodong heard this, his heart was filled with joy. He really thought that Huang Zhao had a way. He quickly asked, What way? A trace of mockery flashed on Huang Zhao's face. He smiled and said, The way is to use you as a shield. As he said this, he suddenly withdrew his ability, and then suddenly turned around and kicked out. He directly kicked the unprepared Xiaodong away. Then the 4 of them suddenly grabbed each other's hands, and then suddenly disappeared from where they stood. When the surrounding zombies saw Xiaodong suddenly being kicked out, their movements paused for a moment, and then they all rushed towards the unprepared Xiaodong. Huang Zhao and the others took advantage of this moment, and in the blink of an eye, entered one of the other people's space. After Xiaodong was kicked out, his face changed and became extremely ugly. He never thought that he would be betrayed by his teammates. But fortunately, his reaction was top-notch, and he had been in the special forces before. The moment he was kicked out, he quickly rolled in the air, and the flames in his hands shrank, and then quickly wrapped himself into a fireball. The zombies that rushed towards him immediately burned when they came into contact with his flames. Huang Zhao. Xiaodong gritted his teeth and said Huang Zhao's name. His voice was filled with intense hatred and disbelief. He knew that Huang Zhao was not happy with him, but he did not think that the other party would go to this extent of betraying him. He actually wanted him to die in the mouths of these zombies. And among them, there was actually a spatial ability user. And it was a space that could bring people in, but he did not know about it at all. Those people usually sided with Huang Zhao, and they were all on his side. It was fine if they did not let him know that they had spatial abilities, but he did not expect them to actually work together to push him out. To think that he had risked his life to protect these people, each and every one of them were ungrateful and ungrateful. Xiaodong suddenly felt that Huang Zhao and the others must have been waiting for him to run out of energy before they made their move, because this was the only way he would definitely die. The other party had been scheming against him all along. No wonder when he used his ability to cooperate with him just now, he did not feel his full strength. He didn't feel Huang Zhao's full strength, and he thought that Huang Zhao's ability was almost exhausted. Now that he thought about it, it was probably not the case. Chapter 34. Lin Xiao came to a tree from afar and directly entered the space. Then she closed her eyes in the space and sensed the situation outside. She knew that the level 5 zombie had sensed her existence, so she directly entered the space. The level 5 zombie leader just glanced in her direction and didn't pay any more attention to her. Instead, it continued to look at Xiedong. It wanted the energy core of this human, and this human's flesh was also delicious. It had been watching them for a few days, and this time, it finally made a move and forced these humans here. It was originally prepared to make a move yesterday, but a large group of humans suddenly appeared. Moreover, there were metahumans who were stronger than it, so it did not dare to make a move. That was why it endured until now. Fortunately, the two humans who were stronger than it did not notice it. At this time, Xiedong was thinking of a way to break through the encirclement of this zombie group. He was a little confused at this time. Even if a zombie group suddenly appeared, there were still two intelligent zombies. Even if he killed these two intelligent zombies, there was still a zombie leader. What should he do to escape from the other party's attack? Xiedong only had a fire ability. He could not fly or burrow underground. Even if his ability was exhausted, he still had his martial arts. He could still use his fists and feet to deal with two intelligent zombies without abilities. But against the zombie leader that only had an ability and could control other zombies, he was powerless. At this moment, the zombie leader seemed to be getting impatient. It growled at the two intelligent zombies beside it. Roar dashed, the two intelligent zombies immediately jumped out from its side and ran straight at Xiedong. They moved extremely fast. Their bodies nimbly rushed out of the zombie group and then jumped up, directly jumping on the heads of the ordinary zombies that were densely packed together, stepping on their heads and rushing towards Xiedong. Xiedong was shocked when he saw these two finally making a move. It seemed that the zombie leader did not want to wait any longer. The two intelligent zombies didn't seem to be afraid of his flames. They fiercely pounced towards Xiedong. Xiedong hurriedly threw two fireballs at the two intelligent zombies. However, the two intelligent zombies dodged Xiedong's fireball with great agility. At the same time, they appeared in front of Xiedong, flashing their sharp claws towards Xiedong, who was wrapped in a thin layer of flames. Because Xiedong had used some of his energy to condense the fireball, the flames on his body had already weakened a lot. If he was directly grabbed by the intelligent zombie, the other party's sharp claws would directly crush his flames. At this moment, the zombie leader still felt that it wasn't enough. It suddenly stretched out its hand and opened its fingers into a claw shape. He waved his hand at Xiedong. A chill surged in the surroundings, followed by hailstones falling from the sky. It smashed into Xiedong. When these hailstones hit Xiedong's body, they were melted by the flames on his body. But at the same time, it also sucked away the fire in his body. Moreover, the surrounding temperature dropped, unexpectedly suppressing the fire on Xiedong's body. Puffed! Xiedong's chest tightened, and he spat out a mouthful of blood. But before he could react, the two intelligent zombies had already grabbed him. He quickly rolled on the ground, and then, ignoring the scratches on his body, he dashed forward. He forcefully smashed an opening in the group of zombies and rushed out. There was a building there, which happened to be a big supermarket. There should be a warehouse inside, so he could temporarily hide in it. Even if he died, he didn't want to become food in the mouths of the zombies. He also didn't want the level 5 zombie to take out his energy crystal and absorb its energy. While Xiedong ran, he looked at the level 5 zombie leader. The two intelligent zombies behind him, after failing to pounce on him, immediately turned around and quickly chased after him. When the two of them were behind him, Xiedong fiercely threw two fireballs at them. Then he used both hands to take down the rifle that was always on his back. He fired two shots at the two intelligent zombies. Bang, 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 bang. He raised the rifle, and the bullets hit the zombies beside him quickly and accurately. One shot to the head, incomparably accurate. When the intelligent zombies were hit by the fireballs, they were stunned for a moment. When they reacted, Xiedong's bullets had already hit their heads. No matter what, he used to be an elite soldier. If it wasn't for the fear of the level 5 zombie, he wouldn't have left it to the end. But now that his ability had been used up, he could only take out his last resort. The level 5 zombie saw that its two subordinates were killed, and Xiedong also rushed out of the group of zombies. It finally moved again. As soon as Xiedong saw the level 5 zombie move, he immediately fired two shots at its position. Then he quickly ran into the building, his figure nimbly running in the direction of the warehouse. The speed of the level 5 zombie wasn't something that a human could accurately see, so Xiaodong fired 2 shots at it. It was simply impossible to hit the zombie leader. It turned into a beast-like shadow, and in a flash, it rushed towards the building in front of Xiaodong. Seeing Xiaodong's figure running into the building, his speed was very slow in the eyes of the zombie leader. So it wasn't in a hurry to directly pounce on Xiaodong and bite him to death. Instead, it was like a cat playing with a mouse. It fiercely rushed in front of Xiaodong, blocking his way. When Xiaodong saw it blocking in front of him, he calmly raised his gun and shot at it. However, its body just flashed, like a spider crawling on the wall. It wasn't afraid of its bullets at all. When they were fighting, they didn't notice that a transparent shadow suddenly flashed around them. Then the shadow suddenly jumped to Xiaodong's side and grabbed his arm. Then Xiaodong disappeared from where he stood. The zombie leader's figure paused, and his expression froze for a moment. Then he blinked his eyes with a dumbfounded face, and then reacted. He angrily opened his mouth and roared, "Roar dash!" It fiercely jumped to the place where Xiaodong disappeared and anxiously circled around. But it still didn't smell Xiaodong's breath, only the smell that he left behind. Roar, roar, roar dash! The zombie leader didn't expect that the meat that was about to be in its mouth would disappear just like that. It angrily jumped around in the same place and directly used its head to hit here and there, digging a lot of holes in the wall. The aura of its body also rose up in anger, causing the surrounding temperature to drop sharply. A layer of transparent white ice quickly formed on the mourning face on the ground. At this moment, if the zombie was a person, it would definitely curse like this. "Fuck. Where's my meat? Who the fuck stole my meat?" But it couldn't speak, so it didn't have human thoughts. It was just that its instinctive wildness and intelligence made it unable to understand what had happened. Werwadash, the zombie leader, finally calmed down after tossing and turning for a while. However, it still let out a low roar from its throat, and its voice was extremely stuffy and puzzled. It just couldn't figure out why this human had disappeared. It had clearly observed for a long time and confirmed that this human didn't have the ability to use space. If he did, why didn't he use it earlier? Why wait until now? But he had already disappeared. Chapter 35. Xiaodong was shooting at the level 5 zombie that was crawling all over the wall when he suddenly felt his vision blur. Then the scene in front of him changed drastically. The wall of the broken building was gone. The level 5 zombie was gone. What the hell were these grass and this lake? Before he could figure out what was going on in front of him, he suddenly turned around vigilantly and pointed his gun at the figure standing not far from him. Zombie? Xiaodong was stunned for a moment and then subconsciously fired at the zombie. Bang dash, Lin Xiao only slightly shook the bullet that was shot at her and grabbed it with her hand. The bullet was caught in her palm. The trajectory of the bullet was very slow in her eyes, so she didn't even need to look and easily caught it. Xiaodong. She actually caught his bullet. This zombie was very strong. However, he couldn't tell what level it was. Xiaodong's heart sank when he saw Lin Xiao easily catch his bullet. Looking at this strange environment, he guessed that this was a space zombie? Before he could confirm the fact, he saw the zombie opposite him throw the bullet at him with a look of disgust. Xiaodong, who was lightly hit in the head by the bullet, was speechless. What did this zombie mean by looking at him with disgust and disdain? Since when did zombies have such a human-like expression? Wasn't this a little too similar? Although Xiaodong was confused by Lin Xiao's action and looked at her, he didn't let his guard down. He tensed up and stared at Lin Xiao with his gun raised. Then he saw the zombie make a strange gesture. After seeing this gesture, Xiaodong was dumbfounded again. The other party's gesture told him, "Pause, the situation has changed." It wasn't important that he could understand the zombie's meaning. What was important was that the zombie's gesture was the code word gesture in the Special Forces training camp. Even ordinary soldiers might not know the code word gesture. How could a zombie know it? Could it be that this zombie was a Special Forces soldier before she died? Could it be that when she died and became a zombie, she still had her memories of her life? But that was impossible. The infection of the virus would first infect the brain. The nerves in the brain were basically eroded, so they became zombies. They were completely unconscious and only had the instinct to eat human flesh. Even if he leveled up, he wouldn't recover his previous memories. Just as Xie Dong was sizing up Lin Xiao, a stone suddenly flew toward him. It hit Xie Dong's body. Then a small figure suddenly ran in front of Lin Xiao and stood in front of her with open arms. She stared at Xie Dong warily. Xie Dong was speechless. Was he seeing things? Why did he see Leader Wu's precious daughter here? Wu Yueling saw a stranger appear, but this stranger pointed a gun at the zombies. She panicked. She knew that this was a gun, and that this gun could explode a zombie's head. She couldn't let this person smash the zombie's head. Xie Dong stared at Wu Yueling blankly and asked, "You're not. You're. Come here." Suddenly, he anxiously wanted to call Wu Yueling over, because he just realized that there was a man-eating zombie standing behind this child. But before he could finish, he suddenly felt dizzy and almost knelt down. Xie Dong looked at the wound on his body that was scratched by the zombie. He knew that the virus in his body had started to act up. He had been highly focused before, but the appearance of the little girl had disrupted his concentration. As soon as he relaxed, his body immediately reacted to the virus. Xie Dong reluctantly pointed the gun at Lin Xiao and said to Wu Yueling, You come here. That's a zombie. It will eat you." He didn't have the time to think about why this zombie knew the hand signals and code words that only the special forces knew. He just wanted the child to leave that dangerous zombie. Although he didn't know why this child was in this zombie's space, but it didn't eat her. There were too many questions, and Xie Dong didn't have time to think about it. Who knew that after Wu Yueling heard his words, she would shake her head. She still stood in front of the zombie and didn't move. Lin Xiao looked at Xie Dong's expression and her eyes flashed. She knew that the virus in his body was acting up. When she saw Xie Dong rush out of the zombie crowd, Lin Xiao knew that it was too late to save him. But she didn't have a choice. She couldn't brazenly go out and fight with that level 5 zombie for food, because she felt that she couldn't beat the level 5 zombie leader. At that time, she was also very anxious, thinking about how to hide her body, in the case of not alarming the zombie leader. She saved Xie Dong. Then, she suddenly entered a very strange state. At that time, she only felt dizzy as if she was about to fall asleep, and then she saw some blurred images. That feeling, it was like a dream, but also like a fantasy. Then when she woke up again, she saw a bullet piercing through the air and flying towards her. Fortunately, her eyes were different from ordinary people. She could clearly see the trajectory of the bullet, and she felt that the speed of the bullet wasn't fast. By the time she reacted, her hand had already caught the bullet faster than her brain could react. She actually shot her with a bullet. Lin Xiao was a little angry at that time, and then she returned the bullet in disgust. Then she made a hand signal that only the special forces knew to him. From Xie Dong's previous battle, she could tell that Xie Dong was a mixed special forces soldier at a glance. So, she gestured for him to stop for the time being. He just didn't expect Xiao Budian to run out at this time. He even stood in front of her, looking like he wanted to protect her. Lin Xiao was a little surprised. She really didn't expect this. This little guy was afraid that he would be in danger. Although he was small, his courage was not small. Did he run out to block her just because he didn't want her to die? Was she not afraid of death? Lin Xiao felt a little gratified. At least this child had thought of protecting her. He actually thought of protecting her. Who would want to protect a zombie? She gently stretched out her hand and held Wu Yueling's small arm. Then, she walked out from behind Wu Yueling and turned her body slightly to block her, because Lin Xiao could see that Xie Dong was in the midst of turning into a corpse. Ugh! At this moment, Xie Dong was struck by an intense and terrifying pain in his brain. He instantly abandoned his concern for Wu Yueling's safety because he couldn't care about himself anymore. The intense pain in his head made him bend over, and the rifle fell from his hand. For a former soldier, a gun was his life. Even the gun had fallen. It could only be said that Xie Dong was in so much pain that he couldn't maintain his consciousness. He clutched his head tightly with both hands and pressed down hard on his head. His body bent down and fell to the ground. His entire body twitched and curled into a ball. Chapter 36. Looking at Xie Dong's expression, Wu Yueling was puzzled. She blankly watched him curl into a ball on the ground, and then looked up at Lin Xiao in confusion. His eyes were filled with curiosity and question marks. Lin Xiao pointed at Xiedong, then at himself. Then, he flicked his fingernails in the air, making a move that only zombies would do. Wu Yueling immediately understood what Lin Xiao meant. She retreated slightly and hid behind Lin Xiao. Only half of its head and a pair of eyes could be seen. Is that person going to turn into a zombie? Would he also become a man-eater? Wu Yueling thought to herself. Suddenly, she felt scared again. Lin Xiao looked at Wu Yueling's rabbit-like eyes and felt speechless. The mind of a child was really hard to understand. Just now, he was standing in front of her fearlessly, but now he was hiding behind her in fear. Ah! At this moment, Xiedong's face was twisted as he screamed in pain. His voice was very painful and miserable, but now no one could stop him from turning into a corpse. Ah! He yelled in pain while gritting his teeth. However, he was unable to squeeze these 3 words out of his mouth. Fortunately, he had finished speaking. He didn't know if the zombies could understand him, and he didn't know if Wu Yueling could hear him. At this moment, he just subconsciously wanted to die quickly and didn't want to endure this kind of pain anymore. After Xiedong shouted, his expression became even more ferocious. His body was no longer curled up into a ball and twitching. Instead, he suddenly sprang up and began to struggle and roll on the ground. He rolled around on the ground crazily, twisting his body into some abnormal angles. Lin Xiao pushed Wu Yueling back a few steps, her eyes fixed on the man who was turning into a zombie. The veins on Xiedong's face were bulging, and his mouth was wide open. A mouthful of white teeth was exposed, looking very frightening. But at this moment, there was still a little bit of emotion in his eyes. It was a plea. He looked at Lin Xiao pleadingly. At this time, he already felt that this zombie would not harm people, or else it would not have saved him from the mouth of the level 5 zombie leader. And Wu Yueling wouldn't be standing with her like this without any reason. His last thought was that this zombie could kill him. Lin Xiao looked at Xiedong, whose eyes were so wide that they almost popped out of their sockets. The whites of his eyes started to roll, and his eyeballs started to turn gray. She flicked her sharp claws and rushed out from Wu Yueling's front. In the blink of an eye, it arrived in front of Xiedong, who had already been twisted into a strange shape and was ready to stab its claws into his skull. But at this moment, something unexpected happened. Xiedong, who had been rolling on the ground, suddenly had a flash in his eyes. Then, his body jerked violently and his head tilted to the side. He actually dodged Lin Xiao's claws, and then his body crawled on the ground like a spider. Using both his hands and feet to prop himself up, he quickly crawled towards the lake. He arrived at the lakeside in no time. With a bounce of his 4 legs, he leaped onto the lakeside. Plop! He actually jumped into the lake by himself. Lin Xiao stood there dumbfounded, still maintaining the posture of stretching out her claws. She looked at the zombie that Xiedong had turned into. In the blink of an eye, he dodged her attack and jumped into the lake. Lin Xiao immediately rushed to the lakeside and looked at the ripples on the surface of the lake. All the zombies were gone. To be honest, Lin Xiao had never gone into the middle of the lake. She had always been bathing by the lakeside, and she hadn't had the time to go down to the middle of the lake. She didn't know how deep it was, and she didn't know what was inside. Now, she let a newborn zombie go down first. And the zombie that Xiedong had turned into was also very strange. It was obviously not an ordinary zombie. It looked like it had directly entered the level 1 or 2 stage. Otherwise, it wouldn't have moved so quickly and reacted so quickly. Lin Xiao stood by the lakeside, frowning. This was not good. He let a low-level zombie hide in his space. If there was no one in the space, it would be fine, but the problem was that there was a child here. But she didn't dare to go down to find that zombie. She was afraid that she would go down. It would be troublesome if that thing climbed up from the other side. Lin Xiao felt that she couldn't completely control this space. If she could feel the situation under the lake, it would be better. Because she could only sense the space above the lake, she couldn't sense anything under the lake. Now she could only temporarily guard the space and wait for Xiedong to come out, because she couldn't let Wu Yueling out of the space. There were zombies outside. It wasn't safer than this one. She returned to Wu Yueling's side, and pointed to the place where the furniture was. She told her to stay there. Wu Yueling also stared at the water curiously. She didn't know what happened to the person who had turned into a zombie in the water. Would he drown? Or could he swim like a fish? Seeing Lin Xiao's gesture, she knew that she couldn't stay here. She didn't dare. So when Lin Xiao raised her hand and pointed to the place where the bed and sofa were, she immediately turned around and walked over there. She also had to make sure that Lin Xiao was also by her side. Lin Xiao followed behind her, looking back at the gradually calming lake as she walked. But just when she thought that Xiedong would stay under the lake for a long time, Lin Xiao followed Wu Yueling for a few steps. Suddenly, her ears twitched, and she stopped. Lin Xiao stopped and turned around to stare at the surface of the lake without blinking. Sure enough, the surface of the lake that was slowly calming down began to surge again. At this moment, the water began to churn slightly again, as if something was about to emerge from the water. In fact, something did come out. It was the Xiedong zombie that had jumped in not long ago. There was a ripple in the water, and then a figure quietly floated up. It floated motionlessly on the water surface. Lin Xiao. What was going on? Feeling that Lin Xiao stopped behind her, Wu Yueling also stopped. Her senses were very sharp, so Lin Xiao didn't follow behind her. She immediately felt it. She turned around and looked at Lin Xiao. Lin Xiao's eyes were staring straight at the lake. Wu Yueling curiously leaned over and stood behind Lin Xiao's legs. She also stuck out her head and looked at the lake. Only then did she see the motionless figure floating on the water surface. Lin Xiao frowned. She didn't know what was going on. Why did Xiedong become like this after entering the water after turning into a zombie? But she remembered that when she first entered the water, she seemed to have fallen asleep for a long time before waking up. She didn't know if Xiedong's situation was the same as hers. Lin Xiao thought for a moment. Since this guy had already floated up by himself, then of course she had to go over and take a look. This guy was already in a state where he couldn't move. Then she could just touch him and send him out of the space. Chapter 37. Thinking of this, Lin Xiao immediately turned around and squatted down to look at Wu Yueling. He pointed a finger at her, then at the furniture. Then she told her to go over. Lin Xiao then pointed at herself, then at Xiedong who had turned into a zombie on the surface of the lake. Then she pointed at the sky. In any case, it was just a series of gestures, wanting Wu Yueling to go over and stay there by herself, not to run around. Then she went to clean up the thing on the surface of the water and shut it out of the space. Wu Yueling looked at her silently for a while. She didn't know if she understood or didn't understand. She didn't go to the place with the bed, but stood in front of Lin Xiao and looked at her eyes. Lin Xiao. At this moment, she could no longer sense Wu Yueling's thoughts. After this child's emotions calmed down, once this child calmed down, Lin Xiao could rarely sense what she was thinking. Seeing that Wu Yueling was only looking at her, Lin Xiao looked back at Xiedong who was still floating on the surface of the water. She stood up, put her hands on the little one's shoulders, and pushed her back to face the direction of the bed. Then she pushed her a few steps. Wu Yueling then walked forward, but she would look back at Lin Xiao after every 2 steps. Then she continued to walk. Lin Xiao saw that she finally walked forward, then she turned back to the surface of the lake. She carefully stared at Xiedong's body and sniffed him. Xiedong was floating with his back facing up, so she couldn't see his face. But Lin Xiao sensed that his breath and smell had changed. It wasn't the original human smell, and it wasn't the smell before he suddenly turned into a zombie and jumped into the water. She felt that Xiedong's breath was a bit strange. The human smell was gone, and the zombie smell was also very weak. Lin Xiao couldn't tell what kind of ghost Xiedong was now. Lin Xiao stretched her feet into the water and slowly moved towards Xiedong. Xiedong's position wasn't very far from the shore, about 6 or 7 meters away. Lin Xiao had never been so far into the lake, so she was a bit cautious. When she was 3 meters away from the shore, the water was already up to her chest. She immediately kicked her legs and swam over. This was faster than walking in the water. When she swam to Xiedong's side, she didn't see any changes. Lin Xiao thought about it and suddenly felt a little silly. She didn't know when she became so timid. She was a zombie anyway. How could he be afraid of being bitten by this fellow? Not to mention, with his current strength, It was impossible for him to do so. Even if he wanted to, he might not be able to bite himself. When he thought of that, Lin Xiao immediately extended his hand towards Xie Dong without fear. She flipped him over and grabbed him by the collar behind his neck with one hand. Then she dragged him to the shore. When they swam ashore, Lin Xiao dragged Xie Dong up and casually threw him onto the empty ground on the shore. Only then did she see his face clearly. His face, which was twisted and full of veins, had now returned to normal. It was just that his face was a little pale and green, like the skin color of a normal zombie. Those whose mouths weren't cracked and their noses weren't crooked had their eyes closed. He looked like a normal dead person, and there was no sign of him turning into a zombie. Lin Xiao crouched down beside Xie Dong and stared at his face. Then, he silently said, "He looks average. 5 points." Then, she reached out her hands and pinched Xie Dong's teeth. Xie Dong opened his mouth, revealing his teeth. Sure enough, a row of flat teeth had become sharp at this time. Lin Xiao sniffed and realized that Xie Dong's mouth didn't have the stench that a zombie should have. Letting go of his teeth, Lin Xiao looked at Xie Dong's hands. His fingernails hadn't grown out yet, but the bones of his fingers had already changed. They were curved like hooks. She looked at Xie Dong's wounds, which were originally festering. Now there was a faint dark green color, which was obviously a virus reaction. He had indeed turned into a zombie. Looking at it, she realized that Xie Dong had indeed turned into a zombie. Lin Xiao thought about how to get rid of him. Should she throw him out? He might become a zombie, but not get shot in the head by a human. He might be torn apart by other high-level zombies, or he might wander around and finally evolve into a high-level zombie. Then he would be killed by someone. Or should she directly stab his head with her claws, then go out and dig a hole to bury him, so that he could rest in peace? Lin Xiao felt that it was better to bury him. Thinking about it, Lin Xiao closed her eyes and looked outside. Then, she realized that this method couldn't be used, because the level 5 zombie was still guarding in the same place, as if waiting for her to go out. Unless she entered that wandering soul state again, she couldn't leave with the space. Lin Xiao tried hard to think about the feeling when she entered that strange state. She remembered that at that time, because she had been staring at the situation outside with her eyes closed, and then she was highly concentrated on thinking about how to sneak in and save Xie Dong. Then she inexplicably entered that wandering soul state of half asleep and half awake. Lin Xiao still remembered that the first time she had a dream, so she ran with the space to the strawberry field in the space. But why did she have to have a dream? If she didn't have a dream, why did she have to be in that wandering soul state? Couldn't she just do it with a clear mind? Why was this space so difficult to deal with? Lin Xiao felt that she needed to slowly study the function of this space. But now, how could she throw Xie Dong out? The zombie leader outside was guarding like a tiger watching its prey. Maybe as soon as she appeared, it would rush out. Lin Xiao was in a dilemma. She found that she could throw dead things out like this, or throw them in from the outside. But she couldn't throw people or zombies. She could only bring them out and in together. Just when Lin Xiao was squatting beside Xie Dong's tranquil breath suddenly surged. Lin Xiao immediately stood up and took a few steps back. Then she saw Xie Dong, who was lying on the ground, move his eyelids and open his eyes. They were not grayish-white eyes, nor were they pitch-black eyes like Lin Xiao's that had no sclera. They were a pair of normal eyes, black pupils and normal sclera. But the pupils were different from normal people's eyes. They weren't a little round in the middle, but firm. These didn't matter. The important thing was that after this guy opened his eyes, he looked at the gray sky and Lin Xiao's eyes with a blank face, and then blinked his eyes. Suddenly, he sat up and stared at Lin Xiao vigilantly. Lin Xiao was speechless. What the fuck is going on now? Why was this zombie staring at her with a vigilant face? Before she could figure it out, Xie Dong's expression changed again. His eyes flashed a few times, and actually calmed down slowly. The vigilance in his eyes also disappeared. Lin Xiao looked at this zombie with a confused expression. Didn't look like it. Human? Didn't look like it either. What did this guy turn into? Just when Lin Xiao was guessing what he had turned into, Xie Dong moved his mouth. Oh. Lin Xiao was speechless. Forgive her for not hearing what he said at all. But she could sense his thoughts. Xiedong said, so hungry. Chapter 38. Looking at a tall and strong man shouting at him that he was hungry with a blank face, Lin Xiao expressed that he couldn't accept it. Not to mention Lin Xiao himself, even Xiedong was stunned after he shouted that he was hungry. He lowered his eyes and touched his throat, feeling a little strange. Both of his eyes were filled with confusion. Then he narrowed his eyes as if he was thinking hard about something. Lin Xiao stood on the side and looked at Xiedong's reaction strangely. Too strange. Too strange. Not to mention the time needed for the virus to infect, it would take at least 12 hours for him to turn into a zombie. But it took less than half an hour for this guy to be infected by the virus and turn into a zombie. That was too fast. Even if the zombie virus was strengthened, causing the outbreak to be rapid and speeding up the zombification process. But why did this guy still maintain his original appearance after turning into a zombie? Because other zombies either had faces full of blue veins or black blood vessels, or their faces were distorted and their mouths were open. Anyway, they were going to become different. Just like Lin Xiao now. So when Wu Chengyue saw Lin Xiao who had turned into a zombie, he didn't recognize that this woman was Lu Tianyu, who had threatened him with her daughter and forced him to do that kind of dirty thing. Otherwise, a lightning bolt would have turned her into ashes. But at this time, Xiedong's face was still intact. The blue veins had disappeared, and there were no black blood vessels on his face. Apart from his pale face, there was nothing strange. Even his eyes didn't change much. Unless one stared at his eyes carefully, one wouldn't notice the change in his pupils, because the color of his eyes didn't change. At this moment, Xiedong, who was originally trying hard to think about something, suddenly changed his expression. Suddenly, his expression changed and his eyes shone with disbelief. He suddenly raised his head and stared at Lin Xiao, then quickly turned over from the ground and got up. He looked around and quickly fixed his eyes on Wu Yueling, who was sitting on the bed in the distance. At this time, Wu Yueling was also looking at him curiously from a distance. Seeing that Wu Yueling was fine, Xiedong breathed a sigh of relief. He turned around to look at Lin Xiao and saw that Lin Xiao was only standing at a relatively safe distance. He then lowered his head to observe his own situation. Then, Xiedong's expression was dumbfounded. He stared at himself with a look that said, "This is not real." His hands pinched here and there. Lin Xiao stared at him for a long time and saw his series of reactions. A thought emerged in his mind. She calmly growled at him, "Roar! Do you still remember who you are?" Lin Xiao's voice conveyed such a message. Then, she saw Xiedong's expression stiffen for a moment. Then, he raised his head and stared at her. His eyes were filled with uncertainty, bewilderment, and disbelief. All sorts of emotions were mixed together. Gulp. He opened his mouth, but a string of strange sounds came out. Only then did Xiedong realize something. He immediately shut his mouth, but Lin Xiao still understood his voice. "I'm Xiedong." Lin Xiao looked at him. So this person was called Xiedong. But from the looks of it, his memories from when he was alive did not disappear. He actually remembered who he was. "Roar. Do you still remember how you died?" Lin Xiao continued to yell at him, although the way she spoke was a little strange. But she felt that if she didn't say anything, Xiedong, who was also a zombie, wouldn't know what she wanted to say. Xiedong froze for a moment, then his eyes narrowed. Then, a strong hatred leaked out. As he became emotional, his entire face became a little twisted. His mouth opened up, revealing a mouthful of sharp white teeth. His eyebrows raised. A fierce killing intent flashed in his eyes. "Roar. So ugly." Lin Xiao looked at his appearance and roared with some disgust. Xiedong's expression stiffened again. Then, he realized that he was too emotional. Then, he put away his expression and looked at Lin Xiao with a face of confusion. He really didn't lose his memories. He remembered everything from when he was alive. He also remembered how he died. But when he was infected and turned into a zombie, his memories were a little fuzzy. He didn't know what happened. But now, he was dead and turned into a zombie. He was still aware of this. He had no body temperature, no heartbeat, and his whole body was stiff and sluggish. His skin was blue, and he couldn't speak. but he could understand the roar of another zombie. All these signs told him that he was no longer a human, and Xiedong sniffed in Wu Yueling's direction. So fragrant, so hungry, so hungry. Just as he stared in Wu Yueling's direction, a figure flashed in front of him and blocked his line of sight. Roar Dash, are you going to eat me? Lin Xiao stared at him with cold eyes. In case this guy couldn't control his zombie instincts and pounced towards Wu Yueling's fragrance, then it wouldn't be fun. Hearing Lin Xiao's low warning roar, Xiedong was shocked. Only now did he know what happened to him. He smelled Wu Yueling's scent and felt it was very fragrant. An instinctive hunger in his body almost took control of his mind, because he had an urge to follow the scent and pounce over. If this female zombie didn't speak up in time, he probably wouldn't know what he was going to do. And he felt that this female zombie's scent had an absolute suppression on him. He couldn't resist her at all. He was even afraid of the scent on her body. Although this zombie was acting very kind right now, looking at the other's completely black eyes, Xiedong didn't know what level this zombie was now, but it must be above level 4. And the thought she just sent out didn't seem like something a zombie would ask. No wonder she was able to stay together with Leader Wu's daughter. So this zombie was special? Was she the same as him and also had memories from when she was alive? And she might even be a special forces soldier. Xiedong thought too much. The emotions in his eyes were revealed. And after he became a zombie, Lin Xiao knew his thoughts even more clearly. Roar. I have memories. I was indeed a special forces soldier when I was alive. Xiedong, who had been nagged at, found it hard to accept. Roar Dash, you know what I'm thinking? He was a little scared, okay? This female zombie could actually know what he was thinking. Xiedong's eyes were wide open. His face had a confused expression of, what just happened? Staring blankly at Lin Xiao. Lin Xiao glanced at him and nodded his head lightly. Then she said to him, Roar Dash, we can't go out now. Suddenly she felt that the conversation between the two of them was really strange. The two of them were roaring like this, but they couldn't talk normally. So strange. This feeling is so annoying. My heart is so tired. At this moment, Lin Xiao's eyes flashed, and she suddenly saw the pin in Xiedong's camouflage pocket. Her eyes lit up, and she immediately pointed at his pocket. Chapter 39. Xiedong lowered his head and saw a pin stuck to the side of his soaked shirt pocket. He froze for a moment and immediately understood what Lin Xiao meant. He took out a pin with his hand and took out the little notepad that was inside it. It was just that the papers were wet and stuck together. Lin Xiao looked at the wet notebook and roared at him, Roar, your superpower? She knew that Xiedong had a fire superpower, but she didn't know that he had become a zombie. Was his superpower still there? Xiedong immediately understood what Lin Xiao meant. At the same time, he remembered. He still didn't know what his superpower was like. Lin Xiao's reminder reminded him of it. He raised his hand slightly and opened his palm. Lin Xiao saw him raise his hand and close his eyes as if he was sensing something. She looked at him curiously. Puff, he didn't see any red flames, only a spark that exploded in his palm. Then, it turned into a wisp of green smoke that floated up and then dissipated. Lin Xiao and Xiedong were speechless. The situation didn't look too bad. At least there was a spark, which meant that his superpower hadn't completely disappeared. But after the smoke disappeared from Xiedong's hand, Xiedong's sharp fingernails turned fiery red. Then the fiery red color disappeared. However, the clothes on his body quickly dried at this moment. They were dried by his body heat. He was cold just now, but now his whole body was boiling hot. But he didn't feel uncomfortable. Lin Xiao walked a few steps to his side and took the cup of paper from his other hand. Then, she placed her hand on his smoking palm and raised her hand towards him. She signaled for him to try again. Xiedong hesitated. He couldn't control the heat in his body, and he couldn't release the fire, so he didn't know if it would work. Lin Xiao sensed his hesitation and impatiently roared at him, Wu, hurry up! Xiedong couldn't resist her command, so he immediately tried to concentrate the heat in his body on his hand. However, in less than 2 seconds, Lin Xiao suddenly reached out and snatched the notebook from his hand. Then there was a puff, sound, and another wisp of smoke floated. At this time, The notebook in Lin Xiao's hands was completely dry. If it wasn't for her sharp eyes and quick movements, she would have been killed. Perhaps the paper was about to burn on his palm. Xiaodong looked at his hand gloomily. Xiaodong, who was used to having powerful abilities, couldn't believe that his ability had become like this. He expressed that he could not accept this situation. Lin Xiao did not care about his current mood. She took the pen that was also soaked in water and drew on the paper. After testing that the pen was still usable, he immediately wrote down a few sentences. He showed it to Xiaodong. "My name is Lin Xiao. You are now in my space." The zombie leader was guarding outside. "We can't go out for a while. Is there anything you want to do?" Xiaodong was staring at his hands in a daze. He only reacted when Lin Xiao stuffed a piece of paper into his hands. He looked at Lin Xiao's words. The strokes were sharp and unyielding. There seemed to be one or two sword-like strokes in every word. Killing intent flashed in Xiaodong's eyes. He wanted to kill those who had betrayed him. Lin Xiao sensed his thoughts and wrote another sentence. "If you want to kill, go out. You look no different from a human now anyway. As long as you don't speak, no one will know that you are dead. I guess the level 5 zombie outside isn't interested in your meat anymore." Xiaodong looked at the last sentence and felt a pain in his balls. Without waiting for him to react, Lin Xiao wrote another sentence. "Of course, I don't know if it will get angry and kill you for its core as a snack." Xiaodong. At this moment, Lin Xiao suddenly pressed a hand on his shoulder, and the two of them flashed. Their figures flashed and disappeared from the space. Then the next second, Lin Xiao appeared in the same place again. Xiaodong was missing, and at this time, he found that Xiaodong was in a different place, alone in the wind. Shit, he was thrown out by that female zombie. And then he was left here alone, to face a terrifying level 5 zombie. Seeing a familiar red-eyed zombie not far away, Xiaodong couldn't help but want to turn around and bite Lin Xiao. What the hell was the meaning of throwing him out alone? Was he going to feed the zombie leader? She didn't want to eat him. She was going to throw him out and let him be tortured. Even if he wanted to come out and find those bastards for revenge, he definitely didn't want to come out now. Looking at the zombie leader that was already flying towards him, Xiaodong began to roar in his heart. At this time, the zombie leader that was rushing over stopped not far away from Xiaodong. It stared at him with a puzzled expression, its pair of eyes flashing with evil red light. As soon as the zombie leader approached, Xiaodong was immediately terrified. He took a few steps back, but he didn't dare to turn around and run, because the other party's aura was too strong, suppressing him. It was even more terrifying than Lin Xiao. He couldn't even think of resisting or running away. This was the aura restriction of a high-level zombie on a low-level zombie. If Xiaodong knew that he was thrown out by Lin Xiao as a bait, he was probably going to bite Lin Xiao. At this time, Lin Xiao was squatting by the lake. She closed her eyes and looked at the situation outside. Seeing that the zombie leader stopped not far away from Xiaodong, she let out a sigh of relief. It seemed that the zombie leader had smelled her aura just now, so it rushed out. But after seeing that it was Xiaodong, it realized that Xiaodong didn't have the sweet taste of a human. Instead, he was the same kind as it. Only then did it stop in confusion, and even its aggressiveness had decreased a lot. It also knew that if a human wasn't eaten in time and was bitten or scratched by them, they would become the same kind after half a day. But this human in front of it seemed to have changed a bit too fast. It was clearly the fragrant smell of human flesh not long ago, but now it had become the smell of the same kind. And its level was very low, so this zombie leader wasn't even interested in his zombie core. The zombie leader slowly walked over and slowly circled around Xiaodong. Although it felt that Xiaodong's aura was a bit strange, it couldn't tell what was going on. But it didn't care about that now. It was looking for that strange aura, the aura that snatched its food. Of course, it didn't know that the person it was looking for was watching its every move with its eyes closed. After circling a few times, it still couldn't find Lin Xiao's figure or aura. The zombie leader suddenly became angry. It fiercely turned around and slapped Xiaodong away with its claw. Bang! Xiaodong didn't even have time to react, and his whole body flew out. He fell to the ground with a bang. Then he heard the zombie leader madly shout a few times. Roar, roar, roar. After the zombie finished roaring, it turned around and jumped. Its body jumped very high, and while stepping on the wall of the building, it jumped up. After a few moments, it directly flashed to the roof of a building on the side of the 20th floor and disappeared. Chapter 40. Xie Dong lay on the ground, his limbs flailing a few times. He couldn't get up for a long time, so he just lay on the ground. From the looks of it, the zombie leader no longer had the patience to continue guarding here. After lying on the ground for a while, Xie Dong finally felt that he could control his limbs. Only then did he slowly sit up. Finally, he heaved a sigh of relief. His life was saved. I didn't expect to have to worry about zombies when I was still a human, but now I'm a zombie. He still had to worry about zombies. This post-apocalyptic world is really hard. At this moment, a figure appeared at the place where he was originally standing. Lin Xiao appeared out of thin air. She took the note and walked to Xie Dong's side, showing him what was written on it. Is there a map? Do you have a car? Xie Dong stood up from the ground and looked at her note. He raised his head and looked at her in confusion, but his eyes were questioning her. What do you need a car and a map for? The conversation between Xie Dong and Lin Xiao was a little strange. Any thoughts he had were now just to look at Lin Xiao. Lin Xiao had received it, and he wanted to know what Lin Xiao was thinking. He still had to see what she wrote on the paper. Why did he feel like he was at a disadvantage? Lin Xiao glanced at him and directly filtered his current thoughts. He scribbled on the paper again. Head to the southern base. Looking for someone. Xie Dong nodded. He didn't have a map with him right now, but he could borrow it from someone else. He remembered that Huang Xiao and the others had brought a map with them. Moreover, that spatial ability user didn't know what was stored in that space. As for the car, it just so happened that his car was in the hands of those people. He nodded to Lin Xiao. The two of them discussed for a while and decided to settle the scores with the teammates who betrayed Xie Dong. Now that they were zombies, it was much easier to find people. Actually, Lin Xiao had already noticed them when the level 5 zombie leader was chasing after Xie Dong, who had yet to become a zombie. They quietly came out of that person's space and quickly left. Xie Dong didn't notice this at the time because he was dealing with the zombie leader. However, Lin Xiao, who was still paying attention to the situation in the space, saw it and remembered the direction they left in. Seeing Lin Xiao walk towards an alley without hesitation, Xie Dong didn't understand why she was so sure that she was going that way. So he reached out from behind her and patted Lin Xiao's shoulder. Lin Xiao looked back at him. His eyes were filled with doubt. How do you know they're here? Xie Dong also asked her with his eyes. Lin Xiao looked down at the paper and wrote, I saw them heading this way. If you want to find them quickly, shout for me. Cut the crap. After she finished writing, she threw the paper at Xie Dong's chest and gave him a scornful look. She had no choice. She didn't have the whites of her eyes to roll. The despised Xie Dong was speechless. Seeing Lin Xiao continue to walk forward, Xie Dong could only follow her silently. Suddenly, he thought of something else and went forward to pat her on the shoulder. Lin Xiao stopped and turned around. Why couldn't she tell that this man was so sentimental? Xie Dong did not understand Lin Xiao's gaze this time, so he could only use his hand to measure the height of his leg, then asked her with his eyes, Aren't you going to return Chief Wu's daughter? He was probably going crazy looking for her. Lin Xiao sneered with a strange expression on his face. Go back? Hee hee. She had already planned to abduct Xiaobudian. Okay, I won't send it back to that man. It would be even better if he went crazy. How dare he blast her with lightning without knowing what was right or wrong? She wrote on the paper, Don't worry about this. Anyway, the little girl won't die, and she won't be eaten by me. After she finished writing, she glared at Xie Dong, then turned around and continued walking. Xie Dong did not dare to ask her again this time, because Lin Xiao's last gaze made him feel a sense of pressure as if he was being warned. The two zombies walked along the street as if nothing had happened. The zombies that were swaying around them either ignored them or avoided them because of Lin Xiao's aura. Xie Dong had never walked so calmly in a zombie horde. In the past, he had to be on the edge to guard against the zombies' attacks. But now, the zombies had to avoid him when they saw him. This contrast made Xie Dong feel very fresh and awkward. Lin Xiao walked along the road and suddenly stopped at a fork in the road. She raised her nose and sniffed in the air, as if to confirm the direction. Xiaodong saw her like this and also sniffed with his nose. But he did not smell anything. Lin Xiao only sniffed a few times, then pointed to the left. She lifted her foot and walked to the left. She knew that she could smell the scent of humans within a kilometer. Therefore, when Wu Chengyue arrived with his army, she could smell the strong human aura from afar. But she felt that she could smell even further now, but she still needed to confirm it. And the terrain here was blocked by buildings. The scent that she smelled might have been blocked by the obstacles. Lin Xiao led Xiaodong left and right, and then arrived behind a wall. Suddenly, she stopped and stared in front of her. Her hand was behind her back, making a signal to Xiaodong. As soon as Xiaodong saw her signal, his eyes flashed. Lin Xiao meant that the target had appeared and was ready to move. Then he saw Lin Xiao raise her hand and make a few movements. But her body stopped there, motionless. When Xiaodong saw her gesture, he immediately knew what she meant and changed his expression. He acted like a normal person, but his eyes were slightly narrowed. Just as he was about to move, Lin Xiao suddenly swung her hand. She threw a black rifle into Xiaodong's hand. This was the gun that he had dropped in her space. Xiaodong caught his gun, and a strange feeling slid through his heart. He had lost his gun, and he had lost his life. Now his life was back, and so was his gun. However, his life had been saved in a different way. It had only been a few hours, but his life had changed dramatically. His protection of others was in exchange for betrayal. He used all his ability to block the zombies for them, but in the end, he was kicked into the zombie horde. He thought he would be torn apart and eaten by the zombies, or his energy crystal core would be dug out. He was saved by the zombies, and then he became a zombie. The strange thing was, he became a zombie with his memories, but his body didn't change. Xiaodong's mood was a bit complicated. He looked at his hands that were holding the gun and wondered if his claws were also carrying the virus. Lin Xiao saw that he was still in a daze, so she suddenly lifted her foot. She directly kicked him in the butt, kicking him out. After Xiaodong was kicked, his body leaped forward a step, and only then did he react. Then, his expression changed, and with a fierce expression, he snuck towards another building not far away. Just now, Lin Xiao's gesture indicated the exact location of the other party, and the people inside did not know at this time. They thought that the person who had died in the mouths of the zombies was already coming towards them with monstrous killing intent. Chapter 41. Brother Xiao, we tricked Xiaodong this time. Next time, there won't be anyone to block the zombies for us. At this time, the four people hiding in a room in the small building were sitting and talking. Huang Xiao smiled indifferently and said, "What are you afraid of? Without Xiaodong's firewall, did he forget about his tornado? Besides, my ability is about to level up. Without Xiaodong, the captain position will be mine." Hee, that's true. Our brother Zhao's strength is not much weaker than Xiaodong. Since Xiaodong was the captain, he always got the best of the rewards. The ones we get are not even enough to fill the gaps between our teeth. That's right, every time the good stuff is taken by him. And that woman in the base, she obviously belongs to our brother Xiao. But he used food to seduce her. Otherwise, she would have long been in our brother Zhao's bed. Speaking of that woman, Xie Zhao's face darkened, and a strong jealousy flashed in his eyes. But he quickly smiled and said with some pride, "She's a woman, as long as she has material goods. Isn't it easy to get her into bed? Besides, this time Xiaodong is already dead. Who will stop me when I go back? So what if she doesn't want to? Doesn't it mean that I can do whatever I want? If I want, I can do it." And he, at the end of his words, he smiled with a wretched expression. That meaning, as long as it is a man, can understand. Ha, that's true. The others looked at each other and laughed. Their laughter carried a certain meaning. But Brother Xiao, this time when you go back to the base, absorb all the zombie cores and energy crystals in your hands. You should be able to break through to level 4. The 4th level of the wind element was much better than the fire element. One wind blade to cut off a zombie's head is much more useful than Xiaodong's fireballs. A level 2 metahuman said flatteringly. Hearing this, Huang Xiao laughed and said proudly in his heart, if it wasn't because of his level 4 firewall that can block a lot of zombies and save us a lot of trouble, I would have killed him long ago. But this time he is here, we can use him to block the zombie leader. Otherwise, we won't even have the time to enter the space. The other three nodded with lingering fear in their hearts. When they thought of the zombie leader, their faces turned ugly. Yes, I didn't expect that we would be so unlucky. Others rarely encounter a zombie leader, but we actually encountered one. Unfortunately, this is a zombie leader at full strength. We are no match for it. Otherwise, its corpse core would be enough for us to earn a fortune. Right. Speaking of the zombie leader's corpse core, everyone's eyes revealed a greedy look. Huang Xiao held a bottle of mineral water in his hand and took a sip. It's a pity that we didn't get Xiaodong's energy crystal core. What a great loss. A rank 4 energy crystal core is enough for me to break through to rank 4. None of them realized that outside the door they had closed, there was a figure outside. Xia Dongjun gritted his teeth as he listened. His eyes bulged, and the veins on both sides of his forehead popped out. He clenched his fists tightly. He had never thought that these people would not just betray him. Huang Xiao actually wanted his energy crystal core and even coveted his woman. Very good. A bunch of damned ingrates. Huang Xiao and the others felt that it was a pity that they didn't get Xiaodong's energy after tricking him. Bang! Bang! The door was kicked open by someone. The force was so strong that it actually sent the metal door flying in. With a bang, it hit the ground. The 4 people in the room instantly jumped up. In the blink of an eye, they all aimed their weapons at the door, but they didn't immediately shoot, because there was a familiar figure standing at the door. Xiaodong, you didn't die? One of them saw clearly that it was Xiaodong standing at the door and immediately shouted in shock. Bang! What responded to him was a bullet. That person didn't react and looked at his chest. With a confused face, he looked at his own blood gushing out from the bullet hole in his chest. It seeped into his clothes. Xiaodong closed his eyes and took a deep breath. The aroma of the blood made the hunger in his stomach swell instantly. A voice sounded in his mind. Eat him, eat him, eat him. Right at this moment, a blade of air pierced through the air and flew towards him. Xiaodong tilted his head slightly. He didn't even open his eyes and dodged the air blade. Pooh! The air blade cut a deep knife mark on the wall behind him. Xiaodong? Ha ha ha. You didn't die? That's great. Originally, I thought it was a pity that your core crystal was taken advantage of by that zombie leader. I didn't think you actually didn't die. That's not the main point. The main point is that you came back to die. Ha ha ha. When Huang Xiao saw Xiaodong, his eyes shot out light. He looked at Xiaodong as if he was looking at a dead object. However, there was a hint of greed in his eyes. He didn't have the slightest bit of guilt or shame. Instead, he looked as if he had let go of everyone and didn't need to pretend to be tired. It was as if they had already shed all pretense of cordiality and met as enemies. Xiaodong tried his best to block out the voice in his mind. He forced himself to ignore the tempting sweet smell. He resisted the hunger and looked at Huang Xiao with a gloomy face. Suddenly, his hand moved. The gun in his hand pointed at another person and fired. Bang! Ugh, Xiaodong, you? That person didn't expect Xiaodong to be distracted and kill him while glaring at Huang Xiao. The worst thing was that he didn't guard against Xiaodong's move. So before he could dodge, he was already shot in the heart. The location was the same as the first person who was shot. Xiaodong didn't even look at him. He just continued to stare coldly at Huang Xiao. He didn't have much of a reaction to Huang Xiao's arrogant words. Of course, he wouldn't open his mouth to argue with him, because right now, he couldn't speak. After Xiaodong killed the second person, he pointed the gun at Huang Xiao. Huang Xiao ignored the gun and sneered. As a level 4 ability user, you're holding a gun? Let me guess. Is it because your ability has been depleted? Have you recovered? Ha ha ha. You think you can deal with me with a broken gun? He didn't say us. At this time, he had already excluded the other 3 people from his camp. Since 2 of them were already dead, there was still one left. He could completely ignore it. As he said that, Huang Xiao raised his hands. A gust of wind blew around him. At this time, The other person who Xiedong didn't shoot was standing on the side. This man, who Xiedong didn't kill immediately, originally had no ability. At least in everyone's eyes, he wasn't an ability user. But he disappeared with Huang Xiao and the others. Chapter 42. Xiedong just took a glance at him and determined that he was the spatial ability user. Because thinking about it, he did not notice that Huang Xiao and the others had been protecting him intentionally or unintentionally. And he did not notice it at all, only thinking that they had a good relationship. Now that he thought about it, it was because they already knew that this person had a spatial ability. He retreated to a corner, wanting to avoid the battle between Xiedong and Huang Xiao. But at this moment, he seemed to see something flash in the corner of his eyes. He turned his head and saw a figure suddenly flashing in from the window behind Huang Xiao. In an instant, it appeared behind Huang Xiao, completely ignoring the wind around him. It directly reached out and stabbed its sharp claws into the back of Huang Xiao's head. The figure nimbly waved its hand, and Huang Xiao did not even have time to make a sound. He was thrown away along with the wind. But half of Huang Xiao's skull was still in the figure's hand. The spatial ability user's eyes widened as he looked at this sudden scene. He also saw what the figure that suddenly jumped in from the window was. It was a female zombie. Just as the other party threw Huang Xiao away, the spatial ability user almost reflexively raised his gun and fired at it. But the other party just grabbed it with one hand, and the bullet was caught in its palm. The spatial ability user was a little dumbfounded. Before he could react, the zombie moved again. In a flash, it disappeared. But in the next second, it appeared beside him, and a claw grabbed his arm. The spatial ability user felt his whole body flying, and then his vision blurred. When he came back to his senses, the scene in front of him had changed. He appeared at the edge of a small lake. Then he felt his arm loosen, and only then did he notice that there was a zombie beside him. The spatial ability user subconsciously retreated and raised his gun. Before he could pull the trigger, a hand suddenly grabbed his gun, and then he felt the hand holding the gun shake. His hand was empty, and the gun was gone. He immediately turned his head to look at the hand next to him, and saw Xiedong standing a meter away from him. He was twirling his pistol in his hand. "Xiedong, what are you doing? Why did you snatch my gun instead of dealing with this zombie?" The space ability user was enraged when he saw that it was Xiedong who snatched his gun. Even if they had internal conflicts, but in front of the zombies, everyone had to deal with the zombies first. After that, he would solve the internal problems. This was a law that had gradually formed after the apocalypse. Of course, if it was Huang Xiao who sent his comrades to the zombies, then it could only be said that this kind of behavior was the darkest and most common thing in the post-apocalyptic world. Of course, this was an exception. It was just that this spatial ability user had yet to recognize his identity. Now that they were in danger, they subconsciously wanted Xiedong's protection, just like before. However, he had forgotten that he had just betrayed Xiedong not long ago, and had joined forces with others to push Xiedong into the zombie horde. When Xiedong heard his words, his lips curled into a sneer. Sneering, he stood still and looked at him. When the space ability user saw Xiedong's mocking smile, he realized that he had betrayed Xiedong before. He was stunned for a moment. Now, there was no one to protect him. He was just a spatial ability user, and before the apocalypse, he was just an ordinary company employee, so his combat power was not high. After the apocalypse, he had to rely on the protection of others to survive. Fortunately, he had activated the very useful spatial ability later on. Only then did he obtain the protection of Huang Xiao and the others. Now, Huang Xiao was dead just a few seconds ago. At this moment, he had fallen into a situation where there was no one to protect him. At this time, Lin Xiao threw a crystal in her hand towards Xiedong. When Xiedong caught it, her figure flashed and appeared in front of the space ability user. She grabbed the opponent's throat. Ugh, blarg. The breath in his throat was instantly stuck, and the space ability user immediately recovered. But when he saw a pair of pitch-black eyes staring at him, he immediately trembled in fear, and even forgot to struggle. Unable to breathe, his face was red, and his eyes were filled with fear and despair as he looked at Lin Xiao. Lin Xiao stared at his eyes, and could clearly feel his inner thoughts. I'm going to die. I'm going to be eaten by this zombie. The flesh on my face will be bitten off. My stomach will be dug out, and my intestines will be dug out and eaten. Too scary. Lin Xiao was amused as she sensed this person's thoughts. This person had been making himself panic. She clearly did not intend to do anything to him, but he was imagining these terrifying scenes. Wasn't he trying to scare himself to death? At this time, she picked up a small piece of paper, and there were 2 words written on it. Space. Then she placed it in front of the space ability user for him to see. She originally wanted him to clear out the things in the space. Then she let him go. In the end, this person suddenly saw the word space in his panic. Lin Xiao immediately sensed the crystal core in his head, as if a hole had been opened. She could actually see everything inside the energy crystal core. WTF. What's going on? Lin Xiao was also a little dumbfounded. She did not understand why this was happening. How could she see into someone else's space? Didn't they say that only the owner of the space could see the space? She closed her eyes in bewilderment and felt that after she closed her eyes, the space ability user's hole expanded a little, allowing her to see more clearly. When she opened her eyes, the space ability user's hole had shrunk. Looking at the space ability user's expression, she found that this person's eyes had already turned white. He looked as if he was about to faint. Lin Xiao. She really did not do it on purpose. Lin Xiao released her hand in a daze and saw the space ability user softly fall to the ground. At the same time, she felt that the space ability user's hole had also closed. She turned her head to look at Xie Dong in confusion and saw that Xie Dong was also looking at her with a puzzled expression. But Xie Dong's eyes were filled with more questions. Why did Lin Xiao suddenly rush in and kill Huang Xiao? Didn't she tell him to take revenge himself? And why did she bring him and this space ability user into the space? What did she do to him? That person fainted because of her? These sudden changes were all different from what she had told him before. Xie Dong's heart was filled with all sorts of questions. Lin Xiao saw the look in his eyes and knew what he was thinking. She took out a piece of paper and scribbled a sentence. Level 5 zombies have appeared outside. Just one sentence was enough to explain her sudden behavior just now. Outside the space, after Lin Xiao pulled the 2 into the space. In the distance, a figure leaped over like a ferocious beast. Chapter 43. That's right, the reason why Lin Xiao suddenly rushed in. She quickly took care of Huang Xiao and brought the 2 into the space. It was because she sensed a level 5 zombie leader with a familiar aura rushing towards them. Obviously, this was the familiar person from before. And the other party also smelled Lin Xiao's aura, so it followed it to find them. The level 5 zombie leader's sensing ability was much stronger than Lin Xiao's. Not long after Lin Xiao came out of the space, it sensed it. Lin Xiao looked at the space ability user lying on the ground. She thought about what happened just now. Why could she see into the other party's space? Was this another one of her skills? She suddenly realized that after she became a zombie, she gained a lot of skills. Telepathy, space invisibility. And the strength of her body was more than 5 times what it was before. Now, she had another skill that could sense other people's space. It was just that she was not proficient in these skills yet. Her space was too mysterious. Other than being able to bring people in, it seemed to have many other uses like the lake water. There seemed to be other uses, but she had not discovered it yet. And with telepathy, she found that she could easily know the thoughts of zombies that were lower than her. Higher level ones were a bit more difficult, and the thoughts of humans seemed to need to be very close to her to be able to sense them. As for space invisibility, she really did not know where to start. Now that she could sense other people's space, she also did not know what was going on. She still needed to do some experiments. Thinking about it, Lin Xiao directly grabbed the space ability user's collar and dragged him to the edge of the lake. Then she pressed his head down into the water. Not long after, the space ability user began to struggle with his hands and feet. Seeing that he had woken up, Lin Xiao grabbed his collar and lifted him up. She threw him onto the shore. Ugh. Cough, 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 cough. The space ability user who had choked on a lot of water lay on the ground and coughed awkwardly. Lin Xiao did not give him time to react and squatted in front of him again. She stretched out her hand, opened her fingers, and held his forehead. The space ability user was choked to the point that his head was still unclear of what was going on, when he suddenly felt a hand pressing on his forehead. Then, he suddenly felt dizzy, and his mind began to blur. The moment Lin Xiao's hand touched the head of the spatial ability user, she immediately sensed something. Closing her eyes, she saw a patch of white fog. In the white fog, there was a circular hole about the size of a window. She tried to move closer to the hole, but it moved closer to her. Lin Xiao saw that there were a lot of daily necessities and some food. She and Xiedong couldn't eat it, but they could give it to Wu Yueling. She retreated and opened her eyes. The eyes of the spatial ability user in his hand rolled back again. This time, it was even more serious than before. He was foaming at the mouth. Lin Xiao quickly let go. Her eyes flashed. It seemed that her spying on his space had caused a huge burden on his body. Or was it spiritual? At this time, Xiedong also walked over, and the way he looked at the space ability user was extremely cold. There was even a desire to take a bite out of him, but he suppressed that desire. He held the crystal core in his hand, as if he was absorbing a corpse's core. He gathered all the heat in his body into his palm and felt the crystal core melt. Then, he clenched his fist, and the energy from the crystal core immediately seeped into his palm. It mixed with the heat in his palm and returned to his body. When he finished absorbing the crystal core, he saw Lin Xiao had just let go of the spatial ability user. But this time, the spatial ability user wasn't in a good state. He was foaming at the mouth. Seeing Xiedong walking over, Lin Xiao wrote something on a piece of paper. How did the crystal core's energy affect you? Xiedong sensed it and shook his head. He didn't feel anything. It was as if the energy inside Huang Zhao's crystal core had disappeared into his body. There was no increase in energy like when he absorbed the corpse's core. Lin Xiao looked at him strangely. There didn't seem to be any changes when she absorbed the core. She thought it was a problem with her physique. Why was Xiedong the same as her? At this time, Xiedong came over and looked at the spatial ability user who had fainted again. His eyes were a bit blank, and he kept swallowing his saliva. As soon as he got closer, he could smell that sweet scent. That feeling of hunger was crazily surging, making him want to take a bite. But his rationality told him that this was the smell of human flesh, the smell of human flesh. When he thought of eating human flesh, he felt nauseous. On one side was physical hunger, and on the other was mental disgust. This made him feel very uncomfortable. Seeing him like this, Lin Xiao knew that he was being tempted by his hunger. She thought for a bit, then wrote on the paper, "If you want to eat him, I won't stop you. After all, it's a natural instinct for zombies to eat humans. And human flesh can also provide the energy needed by zombies." Seeing this, Xiedong was stunned. What does this reaction mean? He immediately shook his head resolutely, then turned around. Once again, he walked away. Looking at his back, Lin Xiao suddenly felt a bit lonely and desolate. These days, I've already gotten used to being a zombie. But this person still hasn't accepted the fact that I'm a zombie. A lot of things have changed. Lin Xiao herself was an optimistic person with a strong ability to adapt and accept things. Since I've become a zombie, I'll just let it change. She's still her. She still has to find her family and friends. Even if she can't appear in front of them, she still has to see them live a good life from afar, then she can rest assured. Anyway, she used to be a special forces soldier, often going on dangerous missions, and could lose her life at any time. Her family has long accepted this. They've also made mental preparations. So now she'll just treat it as if she died on a mission, but she can still live by their side with another identity. That's enough. So she still has to go back to find them. But Xiedong is different. Xiedong's thoughts aren't as open as hers. But Lin Xiao can't be bothered to care about him. The two of them will soon part ways anyway. What happens to him, that's his own business. She can't say anything. After all, the two of them don't have any relationship or feelings. She only saved him because she doesn't want to see a fellow Special Forces soldier get killed by his own comrades. In the army, they train every day. Team spirit has always been very important. Trust in comrades is very important, and similarly, the trust of comrades in oneself is also very important. So they hate this kind of betrayal by their comrades and reject it equally. But her strength still dragged her down, and it was a little too late to save her. If she could defeat that level 5 zombie leader, then she wouldn't have to be able to completely save herself. Therefore, Lin Xiao's desire to increase her strength grew stronger and stronger. Chapter 44. However, the first thing she needed to do was to make this spatial ability user hand over everything in the space. Lin Xiao did not feel that what she was doing was wrong. Collecting the enemy's weapons and other useful spoils of war was something she was required to do when she was in the army. She had often done such things in the past, let alone in the apocalypse. Perhaps bullying the weak was somewhat shameless, but who asked him to do something that harmed others? Besides, Lin Xiao did not intend to take his life. Looking at the person who fainted again, Lin Xiao could only press him into the water again. After going back and forth a few times, the spatial ability user's breath was already weak and his mind was not clear. Although Lin Xiao and the other person could not speak, she kept asking the spatial ability user to read a sentence. Take out everything in the space. However, this spatial ability user was not sure if he was scared out of his wits or something else. He was a little confused and did not respond to Lin Xiao's words at all. As for Lin Xiao, she could clearly sense the other person's space every time, but she could not enter it no matter what. When her consciousness got close to the hole, she felt as if there was an invisible membrane blocking her. She could only look but not touch the things inside. In the end, the spatial ability user was careless. He was tormented to death by Lin Xiao. Looking at the spatial ability user who had suddenly lost his breath and heartbeat, Lin Xiao looked innocently at Xie Dong, who had run back to watch the scene unknowingly. I'm sorry, I made a mistake. Xie Dong. Lin Xiao did not expect this person to suddenly die. She thought that the other person had just fainted like the previous few times. He would wake up after soaking in water. She did not expect that. He would not wake up after fainting. Now that he was dead, she could no longer sense the hole in the space. She looked at Xie Dong awkwardly. After all, this person was her enemy, not hers. Xie Dong did not have much of an opinion. After all, Lin Xiao was his savior. It did not matter if this person died. However, it was a pity for the things inside the space. Up until now, if a spatial ability user died, no one could obtain the things inside the space. No one would be able to obtain the things inside his space. Now, all space ability users had a life-saving condition. Lin Xiao looked at the dead dimensional ability user, then looked at Wu Yueling, who was watching them from afar. Wu Yueling had been standing far away from them ever since they appeared. He seemed to be wary of Xie Dong, who was beside Lin Xiao, not because he was a zombie, but because Wu Yueling was never close to people. Even in the base, only Wu Chengyue and Mingyu were allowed to approach. Even Xiao Yunlong did not pay much attention to him. It was a special case that she could get close to Lin Xiao, but it didn't mean that she could get close to other people around her. Lin Xiao could also sense the space of space ability users. Although he was dead, his space did not disappear. It seemed to have been preserved in his crystal core. Right now, she had the urge to dig out the other party's crystal core and study it. But thinking that what she was going to do next might be a little bloody, she remembered that there was another little person in the space. This kind of skull-digging scene, of course, couldn't be seen by children, but she could not leave her own space, because the moment she closed her eyes, she felt her heart pounding. They could see the level 5 zombie outside, looking for something in the house where they killed Huang Xiao and the others. And at this time, in addition to it, there were 2 level 3 zombies standing obediently in the corner. The 3 zombies' mouths and teeth were full of blood, and the 3 corpses in the house at this time had their stomachs and heads dug out. They were lying on the ground dripping with blood. After the end of the world, zombies not only like to eat human flesh and drink human blood, but also especially like to eat human brains. High-level zombies like to eat human internal organs. Of course, they also like to eat brain. So after the end of the world, corpses that were often seen had their stomachs and heads dug out. At a glance, it was obvious that they had been eaten by zombies. Lin Xiao knew at a glance that the level 5 zombie was looking for her, because this zombie stayed at the window where she appeared for a long time. It was really persistent, It actually kept chasing her without letting go. Lin Xiao was somewhat speechless. Since she couldn't go out from the outside, she could only do it in this space. Since she couldn't let Xiaobuddy in see, she would let Xiedong block it. She wrote a sentence on the paper and handed it to Xiedong. After Xiedong saw it, he immediately went behind Lin Xiao to block her. He faced Wu Yueling so that she could only see herself and not what Lin Xiao was doing behind him. Lin Xiao looked back and did not see Wu Yueling's figure. Only then did she stretch out her claws and cut open the spatial ability user's head. When she cut off Huang Zhao's head just now, she smelled a rich fragrance. But at that time, she quickly took out the crystal core and then brought Xiedong and the spatial ability user into her space. She didn't even have time to smell that fragrance. Now that she cut open the spatial ability user's head, she immediately smelled that fragrance again. No wonder other zombies would eat brain seeds, because this fragrance was different from human flesh. Human flesh was fragrant and sweet, but the brain was fragrant and fragrant. But it seemed even more delicious. Don't ask why Lin Xiao felt that way. It was just an instinct after smelling it. So the temptation of this brain was even greater. Not only did Lin Xiao fiercely smell it, but her mind was also a little sluggish. Even Xiedong behind her could not help but turn around and was forcefully sniffing in her direction. Lin Xiao immediately woke up and immediately reached out to push him away. Then she held her nose and did not breathe, although she did not know whether she was still breathing or not. In any case, she just held it. After quickly taking out the crystal core, Lin Xiao sensed the level 5 zombies outside. Seeing that he just jumped out of the window, it seemed that he was planning to leave. After he went out, Lin Xiao immediately grabbed the spatial ability user's corpse and quickly flashed. She directly threw the person out. Xiedong only saw Lin Xiao's figure flash, and the corpse in her hand was the moment she swayed. It disappeared from the place. In his eyes, it seemed that Lin Xiao did not go out. But only Lin Xiao herself knew that she had already gone out once. It was just that her movements were too fast and connected together. In Xiedong's eyes, it only flashed for a moment. And the 2 level 3 zombies outside who had not left only sensed a trace of her aura. They did not even see her figure, only saw a corpse being thrown out of thin air. When they saw food, they immediately rushed over. And Lin Xiao did not appear outside. She returned to her space again. After throwing the corpse out, the 2 of them were relieved. She could not help but take one last breath of that tempting fragrance, and then the smell quickly dissipated in her space. Without the invasion of the fragrance, Lin Xiao then calmed down and continued to study the crystal core in her hand. She did not dare to use her nails to pinch it, afraid that it would suddenly melt like the previous few times. She could only put it in the palm of her hand. But when the crystal core was put in her palm, it immediately became hot. Then, just like last time when she absorbed the corpse core of the level 3 zombie, it directly turned into energy. Chapter 45. A gentle warmth spread from her palm to her entire body and then gathered in her mind. Lin Xiao. She seemed to have lost something that belonged to him. Lin Xiao looked at Xiedong. Although she was the one who dug it out, she did not think that it belonged to her. However, she did not think that it belonged to her. She had always thought that it belonged to Xiedong. She was just curious as to why she could see into someone else's space. She wanted to figure out what was going on. In the end, he was fooled around by her. Now, he was killed by her, and the crystal core was also absorbed by her. So the problem was, where was the space? She looked at Xiedong awkwardly again and saw that he was still sniffing around with his eyes closed. Obviously, he had not recovered from the fragrance of the brain. Just as Lin Xiao was about to tell him that she had melted the crystal core of the space ability user, suddenly, her heart skipped a beat, and the gratitude climbed to her forehead. Then, she felt something on her forehead. She rolled her eyes and suddenly turned her head to look in another direction. At the edge of the white fog suddenly rolled up like a curtain and slowly turned into a door-like hole. Lin Xiao stood up and pulled Xiedong, who had just come back to his senses. Then, she walked toward the door-like hole. Xiedong understood what was going on when she suddenly pulled him. Just as he was about to ask her what was going on, he looked up and saw the door-like hole that had suddenly appeared in front of him. A dark, 2-meter-tall door-like hole appeared in the white fog. It looked a little strange, but this was Lin Xiao's space, so there should not be any danger. Lin Xiao pulled Xiedong because she was afraid that when she looked at the hole, this guy would not be able to control himself and rushed to the other side of the lake to eat Wu Yueling. Actually, the area of Lin Xiao's space was not big. It looked like it was only 2 parts. One side was the lake, and the other was the grass. At a glance, the square garden was only about 1,000 square meters, but the lake took up 60% of it. Then, the surroundings were blocked by a white fog. Actually, he did not know that when Lin Xiao first entered this space, it was smaller than it was now. It was just that Lin Xiao did not realize that her space had expanded quite a bit. Or rather, the fog had spread. So, it did feel a little strange to suddenly appear in a door-like hole. Lin Xiao pulled Xie Dong to the edge of her space. He stood in front of the door that had suddenly appeared and looked inside. He was dumbfounded again. Isn't that the space of that spatial ability user? Why did he appear in her space? Stunned, she turned around and looked at Xie Dong in confusion. Xie Dong looked at her expressionlessly. He did not understand what she was trying to say. But when he saw this space, he also felt strange. However, he didn't know that this was the space of the space ability user. He just thought that it might have come from Lin Xiao's space. He found it strange that this strange door didn't appear before, but now it suddenly appeared again. Now, when he saw Lin Xiao, he also had a blank expression on his face. Unfortunately, Lin Xiao's face was too ugly, so his expression was somewhat distorted. Therefore, Xiedong did not understand what she meant. Seeing him like this, Lin Xiao also sensed his thoughts. I knew he was still out of it. So she wrote another sentence for him to read. This was the dimension of that spatial ability user. After Xiedong took a look at her words, he was slightly stunned. Then, his eyes widened as he turned to look at Lin Xiao in disbelief. Lin Xiao nodded at him. Xiedong was also stunned. This Lin Xiao had such an ability? She turned someone else's space into her own? Lin Xiao waved at him, and the two of them entered the hole. As soon as they entered the space, they realized that it wasn't very big. It was about the size of a small room of 70 to 80 square meters, completely incomparable to Lin Xiao's. But there was oxygen inside, so they could breathe. No wonder living people could enter. Lin Xiao looked at the pile of things in the corner of the space. Other than some clothes, weapons, and some miscellaneous items, there were a few packets of biscuits and instant noodles, as well as a bottle of mineral water. A few bottles had already been taken out. Lin Xiao walked over to pick up the biscuits and looked at the date. Sure enough, they had expired. But even if they had expired, they were still very precious in the post-apocalyptic world. Everyone in the post-apocalyptic world was no longer picky about food. Who dared to be picky? There would be nothing left if they continued to pick. Water was also very precious, because the water sources on the mainland had basically been infected. Therefore, the water in the base was still produced by ice and water ability users. But this space ability user wasn't very good. Although he had space, he didn't collect many things. The most precious thing was a few barrels of gasoline. She didn't know if he got it himself, or if someone else let him in. It was probably because of these barrels of gasoline that he was able to survive until now. When they were downstairs, they also saw the car parked at the side. That car belonged to Xiedong, and Xiedong had already told Lin Xiao with a hand gesture. It was a military off-road vehicle. It was where Huang Xiao and the rest had stopped. Lin Xiao rummaged through the pile of miscellaneous items, trying to find a map. She didn't expect to find a map. She took it out and saw that it was a map of Shanghai. Their current location was in the HP district. If they wanted to go south, they would have to pass through Suhui, Minhang, and JS districts before they could enter Zhe province. No matter what, with this map, she would at least know where to go. Lin Xiao took out an A4-sized book from the pile of miscellaneous items. The handwriting was also easier to write. It wasn't as difficult as Xiedong's palm-sized note. She sat down cross-legged and waved at Xiedong. She wanted to talk to him about his next plan. Lin Xiao felt that she should go south to find her family. She needed Xiedong's car and the barrels of gasoline here. She just didn't know if Xiedong was willing to give it to her. Although they had talked about this before, Xiedong didn't agree to give it to her. He just wanted to say that he had a car. But now he had killed the person he wanted to kill and found the car. The level 5 zombies outside might still be nearby, but if she wanted to leave, there was no other way. It was not that there was no other way, so she had to ask Xiedong now. What was he going to do? Xiedong also sat down casually and looked at Lin Xiao. In fact, he wanted to know what level he was now. Level 3? It should be, because he had wisdom and memory. But his movement ability didn't seem to be as flexible and agile as level 3 zombies. He felt that he was just a little more agile than normal zombies. Lin Xiao took out a pen and wrote on the paper, "The person you wanted to kill is dead. Where are you going next? No matter where you go, I want to borrow the car and the gasoline here." Xiedong was stunned when he saw these words. He was in a daze. Chapter 46. He knew that Lin Xiao wanted to go to the southern base. There were only 2 established bases in the south. They were the Earth Dragon base and the Hades base. The Earth Dragon base was the survivor base for Min, Gan, and Xiang provinces, while the Hades base was the survivor base for Gue Yueqiong provinces. He didn't know which base Lin Xiao's family was in, but they were heading that way. But Xiedong didn't have any family. He only had a woman he was close to, but they weren't lovers. But he couldn't go back in his current state, let alone see that woman. Even if he saw her, she wouldn't come near him. The base wouldn't accept him. Even if he went back, his identity as a zombie might also be discovered, and he would be killed at that time. Although he looked no different from a normal person, there were machines in the base that could detect viruses. As long as he came near, the alarm would go off. But now that he was outside, he didn't know what to do. Now, he no longer needed to hunt zombies for food, and he no longer needed to team up with others to survive, because he no longer needed to. He didn't need to protect his teammates, and he didn't need to rely on his family. He suddenly didn't know what to do next. Lin Xiao looked at his blank face and suddenly wrote on the paper, "Why don't you come with me to the south?" She was bored and lonely by herself, even though Xiao Budian was there. But with a companion, she wouldn't refuse. Xiedong looked at the words she handed over and was slightly startled. Then his eyes lit up. Yeah, he didn't know how to survive in his current state. But looking at the strange zombie in front of him, Xiedong thought it would be better to stay with her. He didn't have anywhere to go anyway. Lin Xiao already knew what he was thinking without Xiedong nodding. She looked up at this space and wrote on the paper again, "We can't go out yet. You can stay in this space." What she meant was that this would be his room, in case he went out and drooled at Wu Yueling. What if he couldn't control himself and pounced on her? Xiedong nodded. It didn't matter where he stayed. But thinking of Wu Yueling outside, he was curious as to why this female zombie would want to kidnap her daughter. But seeing that Lin Xiao didn't want to hurt her, he didn't care anymore. Moreover, the little princess seemed to have a good relationship with this female zombie. He recalled how Wu Yueling had stood in front of Lin Xiao to prevent him from shooting her. Xiedong was slightly surprised by this. Everyone in Sea City Base knew that this little princess didn't get close to anyone. It wasn't because she was arrogant or anything. It was because she was autistic. His personality was rather eccentric, and he was unwilling to get close to others. No matter how familiar they were, she wouldn't care about them. In the entire base, the only people she would pay attention to were her father and another female ability user. But what did he see now? This unsociable little princess. He was actually willing to get close to a female zombie who looked ugly and acted strangely. Xiedong looked at Lin Xiao inexplicably. Lin Xiao glared at him. Xiedong rubbed his nose. He knew that she had sensed him calling her ugly in his heart. Lin Xiao stood up and walked out with the biscuits, the book, the map, the pen, and a bottle of water. Xiedong didn't follow him out. Instead, he stayed inside. After Lin Xiao came out, he sensed the situation outside. She found that although there were only a few gnawed corpses in the room, the 2 level 3 zombies were gone. But she sensed that the zombie leader's aura was nearby. This thing really didn't want to leave. Since it was guarding, then let it guard. It was fine as long as she didn't go out. At this time in Sea City Base, in an office of the base's administration building, a handsome young man in his early 20s was looking down at some documents. He was wearing a slim white shirt and a thin black suit on his shoulders. He was clean and tidy and had a calm temperament. He gave off the aura of a superior. Suddenly, someone knocked on his office door. "Come in," the handsome man replied without turning his head. The door was immediately opened. A young man wearing a clean white shirt stood there. Although his clothes were clean, his shirt was loosely hung outside his pants. The 3 buttons on his chest were open, revealing his collarbone and half of his chest. This person had an androgynous face. He was beautiful to the point of being devilishly beautiful, but not feminine. He put one hand in the pocket of his pants and held a piece of paper in the other. He lazily leaned against the door frame and said, "Tianny, there's a message here. I don't know if you're interested in it. It's about your evil sister." The man who was looking at the documents heard the words of the person at the door. He lifted his face, his long and slender eyebrows furrowed tightly. He looked at the person at the door with disgust and impatience on his face. He said discontentedly, "I have nothing to do with her. How many times have I told you, don't mention her to me? Can't you see I'm busy?" The man at the door raised his hands slightly and made a gesture of surrender. But he didn't seem to care and continued to say, Okay, I know, but you really don't want to hear it? If you don't want to know, then I'll take the letter away. But let me tell you first, you may regret not knowing this news." Although he said he would take the letter away, he still leaned against the door frame and didn't move. It seemed that he didn't want to leave. Lu Tianyi looked down at the documents in his hands. 3 seconds later, he threw the documents on the table, raised his head and asked impatiently and helplessly, "Say it. What did she do?" He knew that the person who could send the news to him in person must have done something very serious again. That woman must have done something very serious again. Otherwise, he could have asked someone else to bring the news over. And he brought the news himself because he didn't want others to know the contents of the letter. Kong Qingming stood up and walked in with the letter. He closed the door and locked it before walking to Lu Tianyi's desk. He put the letter on the table and pushed it in front of Lu Tianyi. He said, "She did do something, but I don't want to talk about that. She died." Lu Tianyi's expression was slightly stunned, although he was still calm. Only Kong Qingming noticed that Lu Tianyi's pupils shrank slightly. Kong Qingming took a step back and put his hands in the pockets of his trousers. He stood there and looked at him. His whole body exuded a lazy aura. Lu Tianyi was stunned for a moment. He frowned and picked up the letter to read. He asked, "What happened? Why did she suddenly die? Isn't there Lin Yong and the others by her side?" Chapter 47. In the base, everyone knew that Lu Tianyi was one of Yang Chao's women. In the base, no one dared to provoke her. When they saw her, they would avoid her if they could, and if they couldn't avoid her, they wouldn't get close to her. Even if Lu Tianyi went out of the base, Yang Chao would send 3 psychics to protect her. He wouldn't let her die so easily. Kong Qingming shrugged and said, "The situation is not clear. I only know that she died, and before she died, she lost Wu Chengyue's little princess. This woman, I think, there's something going on." Lu Tianyi looked up at him and asked calmly, "What do you mean?" He knew that no matter how bold that woman was, she wouldn't dare to do anything to Wu Chengyue's daughter. Kong Qingming said, "I also know another piece of news, which I just found out. Your sister, before she died, used some unknown method to take away Wu Chengyue's daughter, and then used her to threaten Wu Chengyue. Your sister used some unknown method to take away Wu Chengyue's daughter before she died, and then used her daughter to threaten Wu Chengyue. So this time she succeeded, but not long after, she died. Because Lin Yong and the other 2 threw her into the zombie horde." Speaking up to here, he looked at Lu Tianyi's unchanged face. At this point, he looked at Lu Tianyi's expressionless face. She didn't send the little princess back, and Lin Yong and the other 2 didn't find the little princess. As far as I know, Yang Chao seems to have asked Lin Yong and the others to do something. As for the inside story, it depends on whether you want to investigate or not. He would help him find out what happened. Lu Tianyi waved his hand at him and shook his head. "Forget it. If she's dead, then she's dead. It's none of my business if she's dead. If she's dead, then she's dead. It's none of my business." As he spoke, he placed the letter in his palm, and then a breeze appeared from his palm. As he spoke, he placed the letter in his palm, and a breeze appeared from his palm. The paper wrapped around him turned into a mini tornado and spun on his palm. That piece of paper was immediately cut into pieces by the small tornado. Then it was twisted into paper scraps and ashes. Then the mini tornado flew out of his palm and out of the window next to him. It dissipated with the paper scraps. Kong Qingming heard his words and nodded. He said, "All right, do as you wish. Then I'll go out." With that, he turned and walked to the door, opened it, and left. After watching Kong Qingming close the door, the emotions in Lu Tiany's eyes surged slightly. He was stunned and somewhat unable to accept it. There was also hatred and some other complicated emotions. That woman never saw him as her brother, her family. That was because they were half-siblings, born to different mothers. Before the apocalypse, the two of them had always been at loggerheads, quarreling and ridiculing whenever they met. She was always trying to frame and humiliate him behind his back. He endured all of this because she was his sister. He couldn't do anything to her. But after the apocalypse, this woman didn't care about his life or death and didn't look for him. Disregarding everything else, he followed another expert and ran away. At that time, he was feverish. If Kong Qingming had not arrived in time, he would not have been able to activate his ability. He was eaten by zombies. From then on, Lu Tiany's disgust for her turned into hatred. However, there was still a glimmer of hope in the bottom of his heart, hoping that she could treat him as family. After all, she was his only relative. Because after the end of the world, their families were all dead, leaving only him and Lu Tianyu. Later, the two of them met in the base, but she pretended not to know him. Relying on that man's background, she did all kinds of evil in the base and acted like a tyrant. In fact, the people in the base didn't know the relationship between the two of them. Only Kong Qingming knew. Every time he saw her bullying others, robbing others' things, insulting others, he silently pretended not to see it and walked on his own. And she would never speak to him. Lu Tiany knew that he was very conflicted. He hated her in his heart and even somewhat hated her. However, he couldn't ignore her news. He saw her bullying others, but she never looked him in the eye. He wanted to get close to her, but he couldn't stand what she did. But even if he couldn't accept her behavior, he always secretly helped her clean up her mess behind her back. But now she was dead. His only relative in this apocalypse was dead. Although he had long known that one day she would reap what she sowed and reap what she sowed. But when this day really came, he couldn't accept it. He had been silently helping her clean up her mess because he didn't want her to encounter others' revenge on her. He saw that Yang Chao really doted on her, indulged her in everything, and helped her solve everything. He thought that if she stayed by that man's side, she would at least be safe on the surface. Until she thought about it to the other leader of the base. Lu Tiany began to worry about her, so he asked Kong Qingming to secretly pay more attention to her movements. But she still died, and died in the hands of the man she believed in. Kong Qingming had mentioned to him before that Yang Chao had lost interest in this woman. Lu Tiany stood up from the table and walked to the window. Looking up at the gloomy sky after the apocalypse, he suddenly felt that there was something empty in his heart. After looking at the sky for a while, he suddenly turned around and put on the coat that was draped over his shoulders. Then he walked to the door and opened it. He saw a figure leaning against the wall beside the door. His eyes were closed and his head was drooping, looking like he was sleeping. Lu Tiany was slightly stunned, then said lightly, "Didn't you say you were leaving?" Kong Qingming opened his eyes and looked at him with some confusion. After being stunned for a second, he reacted and said, "I said I'm out. I didn't say I was leaving." Lu Tiany sighed and didn't say anything more. He turned around and walked out. Kong Qingming followed him and asked, "If you were going out of the base, why didn't you call me? I haven't been out for a long time." Saying that, he raised his hand and patted his yawning mouth. Lu Tiany didn't say anything, just kept walking down the stairs. Although they weren't inseparable, as long as they left the base, they would go out together. No matter who wanted to go out, the other would follow. This pair of gay friends in the base, others would think that they were a couple. Because these two people were good-looking, even if they were together, it was acceptable. Although they themselves were not interested in men. After the apocalypse, under the situation where there was a large decrease in women, men who were good-looking, fair-skinned, and thin were all very popular. Therefore, people said that the apocalypse was also an era of gay. Unfortunately, these two were very suitable for gay men. They only liked women's bodies and structure and had no interest in men at all. But there were many men who had ideas about their chrysanthemums. It was just that these people weren't as strong as these two. Otherwise, the most common incident after the apocalypse would have happened to these two people. It had indeed happened before, but the result? Hee. In the end, those people were either cut into human sticks by Lu Tianyi or thrown out of the base to feed the zombies by Kong Qingming. Chapter 48. On the other side, Lin Xiao, Xiedong, and Tiny Tot were two corpses. After staying in the space for a few days, Lin Xiao released Xiedong and his people from the space. Wu Yueling was still in her space. But now the little girl was used to living in her space, so she was not so afraid. He could even chase rabbits everywhere, although he still didn't pay much attention to people. He didn't know if it was a problem with Lin Xiao's space or the lake. Anyway, Wu Yueling didn't really feel hungry. Even if she was hungry, it wouldn't be to the point where her bodily functions would disappear. As for Lin Xiao himself, it seemed that as long as he stayed in the space, the feeling of hunger seemed to be less intense. She wouldn't care even if she smelled Wu Yueling's scent. Only Xiedong seemed to be unable to control himself. As soon as he smelled Wu Yueling's scent, he couldn't help but stare at her, and gradually, he became delirious. Therefore, Lin Xiao told him not to come out of the small space if there was nothing important. Otherwise, a grown man drooling over a 4- or 5-year-old girl would look like a pervert. Xiedong asked her if she would be chased by her father if she took the little princess of the base away. Lin Xiao expressed that he would do it if he had the ability. She had her own space, so who was she afraid of? No matter how powerful that man was, he couldn't enter her space. Xiedong was curious as to why she wanted to kidnap a child, and every time he asked, Xiedong would tell him. She just bared her teeth at him and refused to say anything. Although he was even more curious, he would not continue to pursue the matter. After a few days, she felt that the level 5 zombie would not appear again. Only then did he bring Xiedong out of the space. A foul stench permeated the room. Corpses that had their brains bitten off would not turn into zombies even if they were infected with the virus. Only when the head is intact, or at least 50% intact, will it turn into a zombie. Therefore, the corpses that did not turn into zombies would rot. Because the temperature was very high during the day, even if the temperature was very low at night, it could not stop the speed at which the corpses decompose. Especially Lin Xiao, whose nose was more sensitive than a dog's, almost fainted from the stench in the room. Lin Xiao didn't know how Lu Tianyu's head was able to remain intact at that time. If it had also been bitten off, even if her soul entered her body, she wouldn't wake up as a zombie, right? What she didn't know was that when Lu Tianyu died, Li Tianlan's expression changed. Before her head was bitten off, her soul had already arrived. She just stayed in Lu Tianyu's mind, and a wave of energy protected her mind. Those zombies only gnawed on her face, but not on her brain. So when she woke up, he directly became a high-level zombie. Of course, Lin Xiao did not know about these changes. No one knew what had happened at that time. He was probably dumbfounded and didn't know how to explain himself. The smell in the room made Lin Xiao cover his nose and jump out of the window in a hurry. Xiedong did not feel as bad as she did. He was only sensitive to human sense and was completely insensitive to other sense. Therefore, he strolled around the room leisurely before coming out of the staircase. He looked amusedly at Lin Xiao, who was sitting on the roof of his car. It seemed that having a good sense of smell was sometimes not a good thing. But you are a zombie, right? How could it be afraid of the rotten smell? Which zombie would be afraid of this smell? With the map, she didn't need to enter the city anymore. The two zombies drove straight to the south. A few hours after the two of them left, another military off-road vehicle appeared downstairs of the building they had left. A man and a woman got out of the car and walked into the building, ignoring the surrounding zombies. The surrounding zombies wanted to get close to the two of them, but they couldn't, because they would be struck by lightning. The man in camouflage had no expression on his face, but there was a hint of melancholy in his eyes. He looked at the woman in front of him blankly and asked, "Are they really here?" He waved his hand casually without looking, and a few thin lightning bolts fell from the sky. They struck the heads of a few zombies that were slowly approaching them. With a few puffs, the zombies immediately trembled, and then they fell to the ground with smoke. Mengyu closed her eyes and felt carefully. She looked upstairs with some uncertainty. The feeling is faint, I'm not sure. But it's better to have a little clue than to search aimlessly. As she spoke, she took the lead to walk up the stairs. The two of them searched up floor by floor, but they found nothing. Only when they entered the room with the rotting corpses did they find something. Both of them were hit by the stench in the room, and they covered their noses before reluctantly walking in. Meng Yu's sense of Wu Yueling stopped here. The two of them observed the 4 corpses in the room, and they were all eaten by zombies. The breath of these people seems a little familiar. Have we met them before? Meng Yu covered her nose and calmly glanced at the corpses. She asked with some confusion. Wu Chengyue carefully sensed for a while, and then recognized the appearance of the corpses. He shook his head and said, "They have been dead for a few days, and their breath has dissipated. My sense is not as sensitive as yours. I can't recognize them." Meng Yu looked at them and really couldn't see anything. She turned around and left the room, going outside to breathe fresh air. Wu Chengyue followed her out. He asked, "Are you sure that Lingling's breath appeared here? Could it be a mistake?" Meng Yu glanced at him with dissatisfaction and said, "If you don't believe me, why did you follow me? Go find them yourself." Wu Chengyue immediately tried to please her, and a smile appeared on his handsome face. It gave people a warm and moist feeling, like a clear and gentle stream of water. "No, it's not that I don't believe you. It's just that I think you might have made a mistake. I know you were worried about Lingling, just like me." Meng Yu was slightly shocked by his smile, and she couldn't stay calm in front of a handsome guy's smile. However, he still harumphed and said, "Humph, you see? You said I would make a mistake. Why don't you think about it? Have I ever made a mistake? I know you are worried, but you also know that I am worried about Lingling. Why would I bring you to look for her?" Then she turned around and walked downstairs. Wu Chengyue looked back at the unrecognizable corpses in the room, and then turned around to follow her. "If you said that Lingling appeared here, then it must be that female zombie who brought her here. But among the people here, who was the one who ate? Was it that female zombie who ate them? Then why didn't she eat Lingling?" Meng Yu shook her head and said, "Not necessarily. The smell was too strong just now. But I felt that more than one zombie came here, so it must have been eaten by other zombies. Didn't Yun Long also say that female zombie didn't have any hostility on her? She really didn't eat people. I agree with him on this point. So don't scare yourself. Lingling will be fine." Chapter 49. As they talked, they quickly went downstairs. Meng Yu stood in front of the building and closed her eyes to feel carefully. Suddenly, she opened her eyes and there was a flash of joy in her eyes. She raised her right hand with her palm facing up. Then, she saw a small green grass growing out of the flesh of her palm. The two of them immediately fixed their gazes on Xiao Chao's leaves. The grass was not tall, only 2 centimeters. It shook in Meng Yu's palm, and then swayed left and right. The surrounding zombies smelled the scent of the two people. Immediately, they turned towards them again, and walked unsteadily towards the two of them. Not far away, 3 figures were running in the direction that Lin Xiao left, leaping on all 4s to chase. It was the level 5 zombie and its 2 subordinates. The 3 ran very fast, not knowing if they were in a hurry to chase Lin Xiao or afraid of being targeted by Wu Chengyue. Wu Chengyue's eyes slightly looked in the direction they ran, and then continued to stare at the grass in Meng Yu's hand. At the same time, one of his hands did not stop, waving left and right. Streaks of purple lightning crackled down, clearing the zombies that were constantly approaching them. Furthermore, bolts of lightning formed a circle around the two of them. It was like a huge lightning beam, covering the 2 people in the middle. The 2 people stared at the grass intently. The grass swayed left and right for a while. However, one of the tips of the 2 leaves bent down, while the other flew up in a slanted manner. Like a pointer, it began to point outwards. Then the 2 of them saw the direction that Xiao Chao was pointing at. It was the direction that Wu Chengyue had sensed the level 5 zombie leaving. Over there, Mengyu said with certainty. Wu Chengyue slightly frowned and asked, "Are you sure?" There were several high-level zombies going that way. Mengyu was stunned and turned to look at him. She asked, "Several? High-level zombies? Is it possible that the female zombie is also inside?" She had focused all her attention on the grass, and her sensing of the surroundings was reduced by 70%. So she did not find anything else. Wu Chengyue shook his head and said, "I can't sense its aura, but those zombies seem to be chasing something, and their speed is very fast." Mengyu said, "What are you chasing? Could it be that he is chasing after the female zombie?" It had to be said that a woman's intuition was sometimes very accurate, especially a woman like Mengyu who had a special ability. After hearing what she said, Wu Chengyue also felt that the possibility was very high. He didn't realize that Lingling was heading in the same direction, but now the two were connected. The possibility was high. As soon as he thought about it, he couldn't stay any longer. He turned around and retracted the lightning around him. He got into the dark green SUV and walked over. At the same time, he waved his hand, and a few thicker lightning bolts swept towards the zombies that were crawling around the car. With a few sounds, they climbed onto the roof of the car. Or the zombies surrounding the car immediately turned into a pile of black ash. Just as they were about to reach the car door, it opened. "Leader." A soldier sitting in the driver's seat turned his head and called out to the two of them. Wu Chengyue nodded, bent over, and sat in the car. He pointed in the direction that Xiao Chao had pointed and said, "Go that way. Hurry up." Mengyu also got into the back seat, and Xiao Chao had disappeared from her hand. "Understood." The soldier immediately nodded, stepped on the accelerator, and turned the steering wheel. The car immediately reversed, and then steadily turned around and rushed onto the road. Lin Xiao, who was sitting in the back seat of the other car, didn't know that there were two groups of people chasing after her, and they were all people she couldn't deal with. She looked at the map and studied the route. Xiedong was driving in front. After studying for a long time, Xiedong told her. Strange, she didn't need to study the road in this area, as long as they got on the highway. Xiedong might be more familiar with this area, so he didn't need her to guide him. He already knew which way to get on the highway to Zhe province. Lin Xiao stared at him with dissatisfaction. If he knew the way, why didn't he tell her? He let her blindly look for the road here. She wasn't familiar with this area, so she still wanted to figure out the route if she wasn't familiar with it. She originally wanted to sit in the car and then enter the space. She let Xiedong drive alone to see if he could take her and the space with him. However, when she came out of the space, she was still in the same place. The car was already 100 meters ahead, and she was out of the car. So Lin Xiao could only follow the car out of boredom. She had wanted to go into the space to water the strawberries, because the strawberries she randomly planted in the space really came back to life. And after a few days of observation, she didn't know whether it was because she watered the lake water or the soil. The stench of the strawberries was slowly weakening, and the area where the strawberries were planted was no longer so smelly. Originally, Lin Xiao thought that the strawberries she moved in had a low survival rate. Unexpectedly, all of them came back to life, and none of them died. So a few days ago, when she had nothing to do in the space, she dug the strawberry field with her claws and cleaned it. She picked the ripe strawberries, washed them, and put them in a bowl for Wu Yueling to eat. She still remembered Xiedong's confused expression when he saw her messy strawberry field. He didn't know what to express. Xiedong thought at that time, what the hell were these strawberries? They didn't look normal. They were mutated and poisonous, right? And as a zombie, why would she plant strawberries? Did zombies eat strawberries? He really went over to pick it up. For normal zombies, other than the smell of humans, they couldn't smell any other smells. Xiedong couldn't smell the pungent stench. There was no taste when he took a bite. It was like biting wax. So he had a great dislike for the strawberries in his heart. So he didn't understand why Lin Xiao wanted to plant strawberries, until he saw Lin Xiao wash the strawberries and put them in a bowl for Wu Yueling. Then he understood what was going on. There was also a rabbit. Xiedong also saw it, but he had no interest in the rabbit. So when Lin Xiao asked him if he smelled the fragrance of the rabbit, he looked at Lin Xiao inexplicably. People after the end of the world all knew that zombies only ate humans. They didn't eat other living things. But Lin Xiao finally told him that she could eat it. And she could eat both rabbits and mice, and the taste was not bad. So, Xiedong was confused when he saw her. What kind of zombie is this? Where did this mutant come from? She had memories, could control herself not to eat people, had a very good nose, could plant, and had such a big precious space. Not only that, she could also absorb other people's space and make it hers. This was a bit too scary. What was more scary was that she had memories and the same IQ as humans. Chapter 50. Xiedong's off-road vehicle was driving on the highway. There were many abandoned cars on the roadside. Originally, many roads in urban areas and towns were blocked by abandoned cars, but in the past few years, the roads had become more and more crowded. When people came out to hunt zombies, they all drove out. Therefore, the places that they had been to would slowly clear out some clear paths. When the apocalypse came, everyone was panicking. No one cared about the traffic rules, so everyone wanted to drive away. More and more cars drove on the road, and the result could be imagined. Car accidents happened one after another, and once it happened, it was a chain. So many cars were full of people who couldn't escape in time, or they abandoned their cars. Therefore, after Doomsday, many places were the same. Only after establishing a survival base, did they slowly come back to their senses and gradually found a way to survive in the zombie horde. The two of them rushed south day and night. When the car ran out of gas, they would take out the gas from the space to fill it. When they met other zombie hunting squads on the road, they would usually avoid them. If they couldn't avoid them, Xiedong could only bite the bullet and fight alone. Like now. Just you alone? Where are your teammates? A group of big men blocked in front of Xiedong's car. Xiedong stopped the car and sat in the driver's seat without moving. He quietly looked at the 7 men surrounding his car. As soon as these people appeared, they arrogantly blocked in front of his car. These 7 people were all wearing thick, bulletproof vests. They were dressed in black field training clothes, holding rifles in their hands. There were also guns on their waists, legs, and backs. They looked like they were fully armed. Then, as soon as he stopped, they swarmed up and surrounded his car. When they saw that he was alone in the car, the 7 people were very surprised. They stared greedily at his car and kept scanning. It seemed that there was nothing good. Then they spoke to him with a cold and rude attitude. As soon as Xiedong saw these people's appearance and clothes, he knew that he had encountered the apocalypse bandits. There was a type of people who clearly had fighting power. They were in the base, but they were unwilling to defend the base. And they were also unwilling to leave the base to hunt zombies for food. They liked to sneakily rob other people's things in the base, or steal, rob, or cheat. In any case, they were a group of hoodlums. As a result, after a long time, these people were reported by the people in the base, and the managers of the base drove them out of the base. So they wandered outside, and because they hated the people in the base, they often attacked the corpse hunting squads. No one cared about robberies and murders anymore. He became even more arrogant. Almost anyone they encountered or targeted would not return to the base alive. Therefore, from the actions of these people and the look in their eyes, they knew who they were. Xiedong didn't move, nor did he reply. A man pounded on the car window next to Xiedong and shouted at him fiercely, "Get out, boy!" Xiedong knew that if he didn't get out of the car, these people would flip the car over. That was because the other party was an ability user and not an ordinary person. Quan quietly opened the car door and alighted. The men all had strong personalities. They were tall, short, fat, and buff. As soon as they saw Xiedong get out of the car, they immediately got into the car and looked around, but they couldn't find any food. "Damn it, there's nothing in this kid's car," a tall and muscular man said with a fierce look on his face. He anxiously looked around the car, but he couldn't find anything. He immediately cursed angrily. Hearing that, the expressions of the others darkened as well. They had been looking here for almost a month, and this was the first time they saw a car passing by. They, who were already starving, immediately wanted to rush up and see if there was any food in the car. But the car was stopped, and there was only one person in the car. Their hearts turned cold. If there was only one person, it meant that he didn't have much food. And there were 7 of them, and they had been starving for a few days. But they didn't expect to find nothing in the car, let alone food for one person. There was not even half a person's food. After knowing that there was no food in the car, they immediately glared at Xiaodong. They stared at him and asked, "Tell me, where did you put the food? Did you hide it?" As they spoke, someone immediately leaned toward him, wanting to see if he had any food on him. Xiaodong took a step back when the person leaned toward him. He really wanted to say, "If you want to talk about food, it's the meat on your body," but he couldn't speak now, and of course, he wouldn't really eat people. Although he had become a zombie, he hadn't lost his humanity after being a zombie for more than 20 years. His 3 views were still correct, although the smell on these people was very tempting, making him want to rush up and bite their throats. But he held back. When the person who leaned over saw Xiaodong retreat, he immediately became angry. He raised the gun in his hand and was about to smash Xiaodong's face. He scolded, "What the hell are you dodging for? If you don't want to die even more miserably, then stand still. Otherwise, we'll cut off your flesh piece by piece and eat it." Eating human flesh, in these people's eyes, was already nothing new. This was nothing new, because when they were hungry, they were even scarier than ghosts. Otherwise, how could they survive in the outside world where there were zombies everywhere? Otherwise, how could they say that anyone who met them? What about those who didn't survive? Most of them had been eaten. There was a shortage of food at the end of the world, so in order to survive, people would become crazy. When it came to eating people, there would only be some psychological barriers after the first 2 or 3 times. As long as the first few times were over, as long as they passed the first few times, they would slowly accept it and get used to it. Because the torment of hunger would make people lose their minds and make them go crazy. This was the end of the world. Therefore, what he said now was just to scare Xiaodong. He wanted Xiaodong to be afraid, to make him panic. In any case, in the end, they would not let Xiaodong leave. Because human flesh was also food. Therefore, the current survivors of the end of the world would rather encounter zombies after leaving the base. They didn't want to encounter this human anymore. Thinking about it, people who ate people were scarier than zombies without intelligence. Seeing that the person smashing the gun towards his face, Xiaodong dodged with his head. He raised his hand to block, blocking the person's gun handle. When that person saw that Xiaodong still dared to block, he immediately became angry. He raised his leg and kicked towards Xiaodong. Xiaodong immediately dodged. He didn't fight head-on with this bandit who was actually not as tall as him. Instead, he turned around and threw a heavy punch at the man behind him. Behind Xiaodong was a fat man. He acted as a meat shield to prevent people from escaping. But he didn't expect that Xiaodong wouldn't deal with the short man who attacked him. He actually turned around and fiercely punched his face. He couldn't react in time. The bridge of his nose took a heavy punch. That sour feeling made his tears and snot flow out. A woo dash, the fat man screamed and squatted down while covering his nose. After Xiaodong punched him, he knew that it would have such an effect. Therefore, he didn't even retract his hand. In a flash, he jumped away from the fat man. Chapter 51. Tut, tut, tut. When the others saw Xiaodong move, they immediately took out their guns and fired at him. They cursed, "Motherfucker, you're asking for it, then I'll let you die." But then they were stunned, because Xiaodong didn't dodge at all. After jumping over the fat man, he suddenly turned around. Standing behind him, he ignored the bullets that hit him. He bent down and pierced the fat man's back with his claws. Poochie, a beating heart was pulled out by him in the next second. The fat man's eyes bulged and his mouth opened wide. But the scream was stuck in his throat, and then he slowly fell to the side. With a puff, he collapsed on the ground. Xiaodong only had eyes for the beating heart in his hand. He didn't care about the others for the time being. These people didn't know that they were hungry. But Xiaodong was even hungrier than them. After Xiaodong woke up as a zombie, he hadn't eaten for a few days. Because his level was low, he was tormented by hunger all day long. If it wasn't for Lin Xiao's suppression and the effect of the lake water, he would probably have slowly lost his mind and become a crazy zombie with memories. At that time, he might eat anyone he saw and bite anyone he saw. He wouldn't be able to tell good from bad. Xie Dong held the heart in his hand and smelled the tempting smell. But he was struggling in his heart. Even if it was an evil person, it was still a human. If he ate it, wouldn't it be the same as eating a human? But he was really very hungry now. His stomach was twisted by the package, making him restless. But there was another voice in his heart telling him that he was no longer a human. He was a zombie. Zombies eating humans was a normal physiological reaction. He didn't need to care about those views of human nature. Therefore, Xie Dong looked at the heart and hesitated whether he should bite into it or not. The other 6 robbers who were still alive stared at the heart in Xie Dong's hand. He didn't even look at them. He didn't even feel the bullets that hit him. This strange look made the others dumbfounded. This. What was going on? How could this person dig out someone's heart with his bare hands? Why didn't the bullets hit him? Why did he look hungry when he stared at the heart? What was going on? In their eyes, Xie Dong was still a human. They all thought that Xie Dong was a human since he was able to drive here normally. However, Xie Dong's current behavior had exceeded the limits of human behavior. At this moment, they suddenly saw this man. He put the heart in his hand into his mouth and bit it hard. A mouthful of blood flowed out from the corner of his mouth, staining his mouth red. Seeing the satisfied look in Xie Dong's eyes, the robbers were stunned. His mind went blank for a moment. They also ate humans, but they would at least cook the human flesh before eating them. But eating raw was something that even these cruel and merciless villains wouldn't do. Therefore, when they saw Xie Dong directly biting the heart into his mouth, they were horrified. This person was even more ferocious than them. One of the others, who seemed to be their leader, reacted quickly. He calmed down and observed Xie Dong. He noticed that blood was gushing out of the bullet holes in Xie Dong's body. However, the blood was purplish-black, not bright red. When he saw Xie Dong eating a human heart, he thought that Xie Dong was the same kind of person as them. But now that he calmed down, he noticed something unusual about Xie Dong. His action of piercing a human body with his bare hands and digging out the heart was so agile and direct. It was like an instinctive action. He ignored the bullets that hit him and didn't react at all. The blood that flowed out of the wound wasn't the normal red color. It was purplish-black. It was like blood that had accumulated for a long time without flowing. Suddenly, a thought flashed through the robber leader's mind. His expression changed. He quickly retreated and shouted, "Retreat! He's a high-level zombie." As he retreated, he shot at Xie Dong's head. When the others heard him, they were all shocked. Then, they hurriedly retreated. As for Xie Dong, after he swallowed the first heart, he quickly stuffed it into his mouth. He hurriedly stuffed the heart into his mouth in 2 or 3 bites. Just then, the robbers beside him quickly retreated. They really wanted to shoot at him. Xie Dong, who was eating, was a bit slow, as if he didn't feel the bullets coming at his head. So if he was hit in the head by these bullets, the consequences might not be good. So, just as the bullets were about to hit Xie Dong, suddenly, a figure flashed from the side and blocked in front of Xie Dong. He grabbed at the air with both hands, and then bullets fell from the figure's hands. The robbers. Where did this zombie come from? Lin Xiao threw the bullets in his hands on the ground and glanced at the robbers with disdain. Suddenly, he turned around and kicked Xie Dong. Xie Dong was immersed in the delicious taste of eating a living heart when he was suddenly kicked. He turned around and looked at Lin Xiao blankly. Lin Xiao bared his teeth at him and roared in disdain, "Roar! Don't just eat. Do you want to be shot in the head?" Only then did Xie Dong come back to his senses and suddenly realized what he had eaten. His expression changed, and he suddenly rushed to the side. He bent over and made a vomiting motion. He even stuck his hand into his throat. It seemed like he wanted to dig out the thing that he had eaten. Lin Xiao. He had already eaten it. Why the hell would he vomit now? But soon, she didn't have the mood to care about Xie Dong because the robbers were already attacking her. After the 6 robbers spread out, they continued to shoot at Lin Xiao with their guns. Lin Xiao looked at the trajectory of the bullets as if it was a game. Her body flashed and she dodged a bullet that was aimed at her. At the same time, she rushed toward the robber closest to her. This person had the slowest reaction. He only had time to flip over from the guardrail of the road. Lin Xiao, who was behind him, arrived. She didn't even get close to the robber. She directly swung her claw at him. Plop! A human head was cut off and flew into the air, landing on the asphalt road by the side of the road. Blood splattered all over the ground. After Lin Xiao swung her claw, her body didn't stop. Instead, she did a backflip and dodged a big fireball that was coming at her. But it wasn't over yet. What followed was a rain of ice blades. The superpower user who threw the fireball wasn't very high. He was only level 3. But the one who threw the ice blades was a level 4 superpower. He was the man who shouted to retreat. Their attacks were sudden, fast, and fierce. But they couldn't match Lin Xiao's speed. So when the fireball hit the ground, Lin Xiao had already dodged to the side. When the ice blade flew towards her, Lin Xiao's figure disappeared in a flash. When she appeared again, she was already next to the robber who threw the fireball. Chapter 52. Watch out! The bandit leader shouted subconsciously when he saw Lin Xiao appear beside the fire superpower user who was more than 100 meters away in the blink of an eye. But it was useless, because he had just finished shouting. He saw Lin Xiao wave her claws again. The fire superpower robber. His head flew off. Da-da-da. 2-2-2-2-. The others held their guns and shot at Lin Xiao in a panic. But Lin Xiao was too fast, and they couldn't lock onto her figure. By the time the bullets were fired, Lin Xiao had already rushed to another position. When the others saw this, they immediately gave up on attacking. They turned around and ran. The leader of the robbers with the ice ability ran the fastest. In his heart, he judged that Lin Xiao was too dangerous. So when he shouted just now and saw Lin Xiao kill the fire paranormal, he immediately felt a chill run down his spine. He immediately decided to run. He quickly jumped into the forest, and his figure immediately disappeared. The others didn't care either. They all rushed in different directions and fled in a panic. Lin Xiao chose the slowest one and sped up to catch up with him. A few seconds later, a scream came from not far away. After a while, Lin Xiao came back with a pile of clothes and weapons. Obviously, after she killed the robber, she also stripped his clothes and equipment. As soon as Lin Xiao came out, the clothes in her hands flashed. They were gone. She walked to the fire superpower robber and glanced at Xie Dong, who was still vomiting, then left him alone. She bent down and continued to strip the clothes. Lin Xiao smelled the scent of blood and felt his stomach stirring. It churned as if something was about to rush out. However, she forcefully suppressed it. Xie Dong couldn't suppress his hunger, but she could. So, she wouldn't let herself eat people so easily. Xie Dong vomited for a long time but couldn't vomit anything. He finally gave up. He stood up and wiped the blood on his mouth with his sleeve, then turned around and walked out. But when he looked at the situation, other than the fat man he killed at the beginning, there were 2 naked headless corpses lying around, and Lin Xiao was really stripping the fat man's clothes. The thick blood energy in the surroundings caused the hunger he had just suppressed to immediately surge out again. Xie Dong was stunned. What just happened? How did it end just like that because he was careless? Lin Xiao forcefully ripped off the clothes of the last fat man. Only after putting them into the space did he stand up and look at Xie Dong. However, his face was still dark and blue, and his eyes were dark and gloomy. His expression was dark and ugly. It seemed that although he had eaten a human's heart, he hadn't passed the psychological barrier. From the looks of it, he must have been disgusted mentally to have such an ugly expression on his face. The 2 of them killed these robbers without any psychological burden at all. Anyway, their occupation before the apocalypse was to kill people. Therefore, Lin Xiao treated it as getting rid of a pest for the people. After all, he was the one who provoked them. Of course, she wouldn't show any mercy. Unfortunately, only a few of them managed to escape. Therefore, after those people ran away, they would continue to harm others. Lin Xiao walked to the side of the car, opened the door, and got into the driver's seat. He waited quietly for Xie Dong to come in. After Xie Dong saw Lin Xiao enter the car, he knew that he couldn't stay here any longer. He walked over and got into the back seat. His mind was filled with the feeling of eating the heart just now. On one hand, he was thinking about the delicious taste in his mouth. On the other hand, He was trapped in the circle of eating a human's heart raw. Lin Xiao knew that his mind was in a mess, and his emotions might be unstable. Therefore, he took his place and drove the car. After the car started, it continued to move forward. The further away from the city, the more desolate the road became. There were still many zombie cars on the side of the road. Not long after Lin Xiao drove the car away, 3 figures quickly leaped over. With these 3 steps, he could jump dozens of meters away. His speed was very fast, especially the one in front. One leap was more than 100 meters. Soon, the 3 figures rushed to the place where Lin Xiao and Xiaodong were stopped, and then stopped. It was the level 5 ice-type zombie leader. It had caught up with them with its 2 subordinates. It stopped and stood in the middle of the road, sniffing left and right. It seemed to be confirming something. The 2 behind it didn't have so many concerns. As soon as they arrived, they directly rushed to the corpses that had just died not long ago. But they didn't immediately open their mouths to eat. Instead, they found 2 heads that Lin Xiao had cut off and handed them to the level 5 zombie. After the level 5 zombie confirmed Lin Xiao's breath, it looked at the direction where the car left. Then it turned its head and looked at the heads that the 2 subordinates handed over. It seemed that it felt that Lin Xiao and Xiaodong hadn't gone far. It didn't matter if it delayed here, it would catch up with them in a while. Let's eat something first. So it took a head and used its claws to cut it. Like cutting a melon, it cut open the skull of the head. Then it held the head with one hand and used the other hand to dig into the cut and dug out a pile of white brain matter. Then it stuffed it into its mouth and ate with relish. Soon it finished eating one and then continued to eat the other. The 2 level 3 zombies saw that it ate 2 heads, so they simultaneously looked at the 3rd head, which was the head of the fat man. In the next moment, all of them rushed towards the fat man at the same time. But when it was in front of the fat man, the 2 of them fought again. If you scratch me once, I'll scratch you once. They fought back and forth, but they didn't use their full strength. Roar dash, maybe it was annoyed by the 2 fighting. The zombie leader suddenly turned its head and roared at the 2. So, the 2 immediately quieted down. They stood next to the fat man's body and didn't move. The zombie leader threw the empty skull in its hand and walked over. It cut off the fat man's head and picked it up. Then it cut the head in half and threw the 2 halves of the head to the 2 level 3 zombies. The 2 zombies immediately caught it at the same time, and then each held the half head with both hands, squatted on the ground, and buried their faces to eat. They didn't have the elegant movements of the zombie leader. They didn't even use their fingers to dig. They directly ate it with their mouths. At this time, the zombie leader bent over the fat man's body and saw that the fat man's heart was gone. It straightened up, looked at the other 2 headless corpses, and walked over. Then it used its claws to dig out the heart of the robber with the fire ability. It put it in front of its nose and smelled it, but it showed a disgusted expression. It bared its teeth, but it didn't throw the heart away. Instead, it put it in its mouth and took a bite, and then its expression became playful. He was disgusted, but he endured it and ate it. The hearts of these corpses had already stopped beating and lost their activity. So, the smell and taste were of course incomparable to the one that Xiaodong had just taken out. Chapter 53. But zombies' food was humans. Zombies without food. What the survivors didn't know was that zombies without food would also die. But they wouldn't die so quickly. Moreover, the lower the level of the zombies, the longer they could live without human food. Because they moved slowly, they didn't need much energy. So if they didn't have food, they would wander slowly and lazily. And the higher the level of zombies, they would have intelligence, a flexible body, and abilities. All of these required energy and food. If they didn't eat humans, high-level zombies would slowly degenerate into low-level zombies. Then it would speed up the death of the virus in the body, and gradually the virus would not be active. Then the body of the zombie would become an ordinary corpse, and then rot. But low-level zombies were very hungry, and could go without food for 3 to 5 years. They wouldn't die immediately, but their movement would become slower. But high-level zombies didn't have the ability to endure hunger. Usually, they wouldn't go hungry for a year. If they didn't eat human meat for a year, they would need other things to provide energy, such as zombie cores. However, The corpse core was only a temporary substitute. And among the internal organs of the human body, only the heart was the most suitable for high-level zombies. The taste of the heart was far more delicious than the meat of the body. The blood production in the heart was also more intense than the other parts of the body. So high-level zombies would eat the heart first, which was their main food. The zombie leader ate 2 human brains and 2 hearts. The rest was left for the 2 level 3 zombies to eat. When they were almost done gnawing, the zombie leader let out a roar. It called them to continue in the direction of Lin Xiao's car. They turned into 3 running beasts and chased after it. Lin Xiao drove for another half an hour. She found that she was on a bridge, which wasn't long. It was about 70 or 80 meters. The problem was, the bridge had collapsed. She stopped the car at the end of the road and looked out the window to see the situation in front of her. Looking at the broken road, Lin Xiao could only sigh. She looked back at Xiedong, but she found that Xiedong's face had changed and seemed to be paler than before. However, it lacked the original dark green color of the death chi. Xiedong also looked at the road and knew that the 2 of them couldn't take this road. At this point, he had calmed down a lot, although he still felt very uncomfortable. But slowly, he could endure it. Moreover, his body had also undergone some changes. He felt as if his body had become more agile, and his muscles were no longer as stiff as before. His movements were no longer as strenuous as before. It was much easier now. He even felt the sense of control over his ability before he turned into a zombie, and he seemed to have touched a little. Furthermore, he could faintly feel that his mind had cleared up quite a bit. Previously, he had been feeling a little confused, but now, that feeling had disappeared. He looked in front of him, then raised his hand to point behind him and crooked his finger. Lin Xiao knew what he meant, which was to retreat. Because there was a fork in the road more than 10 kilometers back, they could only take a detour. She nodded, started the car, turned it around, and drove back. However, just a few kilometers after she drove the car back, Lin Xiao suddenly slammed on the brakes. Before Xiedong could react, his vision blurred. He found that he had entered Lin Xiao's telepathic eye space together with his car, and Lin Xiao, at this time, was on the grass outside the car. Less than 3 seconds after Lin Xiao's car disappeared on the road, a figure suddenly rushed to the place where Lin Xiao disappeared. Roar! The figure turned around on the spot, suddenly raised his head and let out a beast-like roar. Lin Xiao was in the telepathic eye space, closing her eyes to look at the situation outside. She couldn't help but frown. This zombie leader actually kept chasing her. It seemed that it couldn't wait to dig out the zombie nucleus in her brain and absorb it to vent its hatred. Unexpectedly, it held a grudge. Encountering such a vengeful zombie leader, it was really enough. Xiedong doubtfully opened the door and got out of the car. He didn't know why Lin Xiao suddenly sent the 2 of them into the telepathic eye space together with the car, but looking at her hurried appearance, it was because she had a premonition of danger, so she suddenly did so. Lin Xiao heard Xiedong's sound and opened her eyes. Seeing his questioning eyes, she took out a piece of paper and wrote, "The level 5 zombie has caught up." After writing, her eyes slightly sank, and the dark eyes surged. She had to find a way to kill the level 5 zombie, but she felt that her current strength couldn't suppress the opponent, and she couldn't beat it at all. And the opponent had 2 level 3 subordinates. Although Xiedong looked like an intelligent level 3 zombie, in fact, his fighting power was not even as good as a level 2 ordinary zombie. Because Xiedong had never eaten a human, he didn't have human flesh and blood to support him. And the 2 level 3 zombies had eaten humans, so they leveled up. There was no doubt about their strength. They must be fierce. So Xiedong didn't need to deal with 2 of them, he couldn't even fight one. And that level 5 zombie gave Lin Xiao a sense of oppression, although it seemed to be less than before. This meant that Lin Xiao's strength had increased, although she still didn't know how it increased. In any case, after being struck by Wu Chengyue's lightning, it seemed to have increased. Thinking of this, Lin Xiao was a little confused. Other people ate human flesh and absorbed zombie nuclei or crystal nuclei to increase their strength. Why was it that absorbing zombie nuclei and crystal nuclei didn't work for her, but being struck by lightning had an effect? What the hell was this? Could it be that if she wanted to increase her strength in the future, she still had to find that man and let him strike her? Lin Xiao, go away. Stop messing around. Xia Dong saw her words and was stunned for a moment. Then he frowned. He looked at Lin Xiao with doubt in his eyes. Because every time Lin Xiao saw that level 5 zombie, she would run away. This couldn't go on. In fact, in his heart, he always thought that Lin Xiao's fighting power should be similar to that of the level 5 zombie. As for why Lin Xiao ran when she saw it, it could be because Lin Xiao didn't want to fight with it. Because if they fought, it might not be good for both sides, and the price they would pay would not be small. Lin Xiao saw his eyes and also felt his thoughts. She wrote on the paper, I am not its opponent. If we really fight, I will be the one at a disadvantage. I don't want to cause trouble now. She just wanted to find her family in peace. She didn't want to fight with a level 5 zombie here. Maybe something unexpected would happen. If she couldn't beat the opponent's strength, if she was beaten to a state where she couldn't move, it would delay her time again. Lin Xiao didn't even have any news about her family. She didn't know whether they were alive or dead. In fact, she was very anxious in her heart. It was just that her rationality suppressed all these emotions. She could only calmly accept that she was a zombie, and then find a way to go south. Chapter 54. When Xie Dong saw her words, he put away his doubts. He glanced at the grass in the distance. Wu Yueling was holding the little rabbit, standing far away and looking at them. He turned around and walked into Lin Xiao's small space. Lin Xiao sensed the situation outside and saw that the level 5 zombie was still unwillingly circling the road where they disappeared. She temporarily gave up the idea of going out. She walked towards Wu Yueling. She didn't know when that rabbit started to have a good relationship with Wu Yueling, but it was only willing to be close to Wu Yueling. As long as Lin Xiao approached, it would immediately jump away. Just like now, Wu Yueling watched the rabbit run away and didn't care. She was actually very quiet, except for her introverted personality. She had been quietly staying in Lin Xiao's space without crying or making a fuss. She didn't even ask Lin Xiao to let her out. Although she was afraid of her at first, she wasn't anymore. She was actually staying here with a clear conscience. Didn't this child miss her father? At first, she always called him father in her heart. Lin Xiao couldn't help but feel that this child's heart was really big. Wasn't she afraid that she wouldn't be able to see her father in the future? She didn't look anxious at all. Other children probably wanted to go out and find their family. Seeing Lin Xiao coming over, Wu Yueling stared at her with her big eyes. She was so cute. Her eyes were black and round, and her little face was pink and tender. Lin Xiao walked over and saw that her bowl of strawberries had been finished. So she took her bowl and turned to walk towards the strawberry field. After 2 steps, she felt that Tiny was also following her. She looked back at Tiny and didn't say anything. She turned back and continued to walk forward. When she arrived at the strawberry field, Lin Xiao looked at the strawberries that had grown normally. So she picked this one and that one. These days, she had almost picked all the ripe strawberries, but there were still many that were 7 or 8 ripened. Because Tiny didn't eat much, and the strawberries were big. A child would be full after eating 2 or 3. Lin Xiao felt that it wasn't enough to just let the child eat strawberries. She had also finished the biscuits from before, but she hadn't eaten the instant noodles. Because Xie Dong couldn't control his ability. Either the water suddenly boiled dry, or there was no reaction at all. It almost burned a hole in the bottom of the pot that Lin Xiao brought in. Lin Xiao wondered if there were any living things like mountain rats in the mountains outside. She would have to wait until she got out, catch a few for Xiao Budian as well to improve his diet. But first, she had to solve the fire problem. She didn't have a lighter in her space, and Xie Dong didn't have one either. Because he had always used his finger as a matchstick, he himself was a huge lighter. When Lin Xiao picked the strawberries, Wu Yueling followed behind her. However, she just followed behind Lin Xiao and did nothing. Lin Xiao could not sense her emotions and thoughts. He had no idea what this child was up to. He picked 7 or 8 strawberries and filled the bowl with strawberries. Lin Xiao took the strawberries to the lake and washed them. Wu Yueling followed her to the lake. Then, she silently watched as Lin Xiao washed the strawberries and stuffed the whole bowl to her. After Lin Xiao gave the strawberries to Wu Yueling, she turned around and prepared to water the strawberries. However, when she took a bucket to the lake to fetch water, she found that Wu Yueling was silently following behind her. She stopped and looked at Wu Yueling. Wu Yueling also stared at her with her big eyes. Her eyes were clear and shiny. Lin Xiao glanced at her and found that there was no emotion in her eyes. She couldn't sense her thoughts and didn't know what she was up to. So, Lin Xiao turned around and continued to fetch water, and Wu Yueling followed. Lin Xiao went to water, and Wu Yueling followed. Lin Xiao went to fetch water, and Wu Yueling followed. Then, she watered and followed. Then, she followed Lin Xiao. After Lin Xiao finished watering, she turned around and looked down at Wu Yueling. Wu Yueling continued to raise her head and stared at her with a cute face. Lin Xiao, what the hell was this child up to? Why was there nothing in her eyes? No thoughts in her mind? She was going crazy. Someone, please teach her. She didn't know how to communicate with an introverted child. Lin Xiao asked her with her eyes, "What's wrong with you?" Wu Yueling just looked at her calmly and didn't answer. There was no reaction in her heart. Lin Xiao could only try to ask her, "Why are you following me? What do you want to say?" Wu Yueling still didn't respond and just looked at her. After Lin Xiao tried a few times, the little one just looked at her without saying a word. She just looked at her, looked at her, looked at her, but didn't say anything. There was no sound in her heart. Lin Xiao, she couldn't communicate. Sure enough, there were autistic children who didn't even want others to know their inner thoughts. Then what was she going to do? What did she want to do by following her like a little tail? One big and one small. You look down at me. I look up at you. They looked at each other silently for a few seconds. Just as Lin Xiao scratched her head and was about to give up on her, Wu Yueling finally moved. When Lin Xiao was about to turn around, she reached out her little hand and pulled on Lin Xiao's pants. Lin Xiao's pants were the ones she found in the abandoned house in the strawberry field. They were loose on her body. She had to wrap the pants so that she wouldn't step on them and fall. After Wu Yueling pulled on her, Lin Xiao stopped. Looking at her strangely, she saw her tug at the clothes on her body. Although there was no expression on her little face, there was obvious disdain in her eyes. "I want to change. Dirty." Lin Xiao, "All right. If you want to change clothes, just say it." You just followed behind her without saying a word. She didn't know what she was going to do. However, when she thought of the dirty clothes on this little one, she remembered that this child hadn't bathed for many days. God knows how dirty she is right now. She must be feeling uncomfortable. That was why she told her that the clothes were dirty. She didn't expect this child to be obsessed with cleanliness. If it was other children, they wouldn't care about this. But since this child wanted to change clothes, she would give her a bath. She could change into the adult clothes that had been washed before, and it was easy to wear. An adult's top could be used as a small skirt for her to wear. How simple was that? She also wanted to wash the clothes that she had just taken off the robbers' bodies and dry them so that she could wear them. Thinking of this, Lin Xiao immediately pulled Wu Yueling to the side of the lake and asked her to stand still on the shore. Lin Xiao went to get a cotton top and a ragged shirt, then put the two clothes on the clean ground at the side. Lin Xiao squatted in front of Wu Yueling. Looking at her, she said in her heart, "I'll help you take a bath. Don't move." At the same time, she began to undo Wu Yueling's clothes. Wu Yueling didn't know what was going on, but she cooperated with Lin Xiao's actions. She stood there motionlessly. Chapter 55. Lin Xiao took off the little one's clothes and threw it on the ground. Then she picked up the torn clothes and tore them into pieces and wet them in the water. Then she wrung the cloth dry and used it as a towel to wipe Wu Yueling's dirty face. After wiping it 2 or 3 times, her face was finally clean. Wu Yueling obediently let her wash her face and closed her eyes expressionlessly. After Lin Xiao washed her face, she saw that her clean little face looked much better. Then she looked at her glossy long hair and was in a dilemma. How could she help her wash her face? She didn't have anything like shampoo here. She could only let it soak in the water for a while. She pushed Wu Yueling into the lake and let her stand in the shallow water. Lin Xiao began to wipe her body with the rag. The temperature in Lin Xiao's space was constant, neither too hot nor too cold. The temperature of the lake was also constant. The other Lin Xiao knew that she was a zombie. Lin Xiao thought that because she was a zombie, her Her skin didn't feel the temperature of the water. But it was different for Wu Yueling. When Wu Yueling got into the water, she even felt that the lake was a little warm. It wasn't cold at all. Instead, her body temperature was a little cold. Maybe it was because she took off her clothes. So when she got into the warm water, she felt very comfortable and fun. It was just that she was an introverted child and didn't show it. If it was another child, they might have already started to flop in the water. Lin Xiao also stood in the water and wiped Wu Yueling's little body. Then she poured the wet water on her body to help her wash her. She suddenly felt that she was at a disadvantage. Taking care of this child, she had to find food for her and a place to sleep for her. Now she had to help her bathe. She also had to wash her clothes later. Lin Xiao suddenly felt that she was a zombie babysitter. She should have returned this little guy earlier. That would have been so much easier. Now, he had abducted the little guy. She still had to be responsible for her safety. Although this could make her father anxious, she herself didn't seem to have it easy. And this child didn't talk or communicate with her. What a boring kid, isn't he? But fortunately, Wu Yueling didn't like to talk and was always silent. Lin Xiao didn't like naughty and noisy children the most. She gets a headache. If it wasn't for the fact that Wu Yueling had been quiet all this time and didn't have much of a presence, of course, Lin Xiao wouldn't really bring her along. He would definitely throw her back to the man who looked so kind on the surface. In fact, Lin Xiao didn't even know why he made this little guy stay. Just as she was washing Wu Yueling, who had been standing still for her to wash, suddenly moved. He suddenly lifted his legs and ran to Lin Xiao's side. He then hid behind Lin Xiao's legs and stretched his head out to look at the shore. Seeing her strange behavior, Lin Xiao followed her gaze and looked up. He saw Xie Dong standing not far away, staring at the naked Wu Yueling with glowing eyes. Perhaps his gaze was too obvious, which made the sensitive Wu Yueling hide behind him in fear. Lin Xiao. Hey, Yao Yao Ling? There's a pervert here. Cough. She straightened up and gave Xie Dong a warning glare. After being glared at by her, Xie Dong immediately sobered up. When he came back to his senses, he realized that Lin Xiao was looking at him as if she was looking at a pervert. Only then did he remember why he was here. Xie Dong wanted to tell Lin Xiao something, but when he saw Wu Yueling bathing, he was attracted by the tempting aroma of food. If he wasn't careful, he would be in a daze. Now that he was glared at by Lin Xiao, the pressure from her body immediately made him sober up. Xie Dong looked at Lin Xiao and walked over. He didn't get too close, just 5 or 6 meters away from the shore. Then he raised his hand and turned his palm up. A wisp of flame, like that of a lighter, leaped out from his palm. It stood on his palm, swaying. Lin Xiao's eyes lit up when she saw the flame. However, she gestured to Xie Dong to wait a moment. She turned around and continued to help Wu Yueling bathe. Then, she spent more than 10 minutes washing her long hair. The little guy wasn't big, but he had a lot of hair. Her black waist-length hair was originally tied into an oily ponytail. Then, the ponytail loosened and fell down. Now, Lin Xiao asked her to bend down toward the lake and soak her hair in the water. Then, he used his fingers to rub her hair. After washing it for a long time, it didn't feel so oily anymore. Then, Wu Yueling came out of the water with disheveled hair. Lin Xiao wrung the water out of her hair and put on the adult clothes for her. Wu Yueling put on the adult clothes. The sleeves were long. The hem of the clothes covered her knees. Lin Xiao directly carried her and walked to the sofa where the bed was. When he reached the bed, he put Wu Yueling on the bed and made her sit. Looking at her wet hair, Lin Xiao took out an old coat and draped it over her shoulders. Because she couldn't help her dry her hair now, she was afraid that she might get sick with her hair down. She could only give her another shirt to keep her warm. After Wu Yueling was done, Lin Xiao went to find Xie Dong. Xie Dong seemed to be practicing how to control the fire in his palm so that it wouldn't extinguish so quickly. Lin Xiao walked over and wrote on a piece of paper, "Can you use your ability now?" Xie Dong looked at her, nodded, and then shook his head. Lin Xiao knew what he was thinking. Xie Dong meant that although he could use fire, he couldn't control it well. And the fire was very small. He couldn't make it bigger. He had just eaten a human's heart. Before, he couldn't use his fire ability. Now, he immediately released it from his body even though the fire was not strong. Although the fire wasn't big, it was obviously a huge improvement. It seemed that eating human flesh was the source of evolution for zombies. But this Xiedong, what level was he now? Level 3? Too weak. He couldn't reach the strength of a real level 3 zombie. But he could use fire now. Maybe in a short time, he would be able to use fire more skillfully. After all, he still had his memories of using fire. He knew how to control his ability. His current source of fire energy needed to be taken from a living person. Although eating a human's heart was very unacceptable, but if he wanted to become more powerful, he should quickly adjust his mentality. Lin Xiao looked at Xiedong and suddenly wrote on the paper, "When we get out, let's practice when we have time. I want to see where your limit is." When Xiedong saw this, he nodded in agreement. He actually wanted to know as well. But, looking at Lin Xiao's deep and dark eyes, Xiedong had a premonition that he was going to be abused. Lin Xiao looked at Xiedong from head to toe. She turned around to wash Wu Yueling's clothes. You're tuning in to the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.